Beneath the shifting sands of the Middle East lies the memory of a world once called the cradle of civilization. Here, between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, humanity first learned to shape clay into tablets, to raise temples from mud brick, and to trace the stars across the night sky. Mesopotamia was not a single kingdom, but a tapestry of rising and falling empires: Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, each leaving behind fragments of wisdom carved into stone or whispered in myth. It was here that writing was born, where kings proclaimed their laws, and where stories like Gilgamesh carried echoes of an ancient search for meaning. Cities rose like jewels upon the desert plain, only to fade into ruin, swallowed by time. Yet the spirit of Mesopotamia endures in our calendars, our alphabets, and the very idea of civilization itself. Tonight, we journey slowly across this vast timeline, from the first villages on the floodplains to the great palaces of Nineveh, from the sacred ziggurats to the fall of empires. Let the story unfold like a dream carried by the rivers. This is the entire history of Mesopotamia, told gently to guide you into rest as we wander together through the world's first great dawn. Chapter 1. The Fertile Crescent and the birth of civilization beneath the wide expanse of the Mesopotamian sky. The land between the rivers lies quiet, as it has for millennia. The Tigris and the Euphrates cut their winding paths through a region that would one day cradle the first cities, the first writing, and the first kings. This is where history, as we know it, begins. The Fertile Crescent, stretching from the Levant through Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf, was a place of transition, a great experiment in human living that would change the world forever. Around 10,000 BCE, the last ice age was drawing to a close. The great glaciers retreated, the climate warmed, and the world shifted into a new equilibrium. For tens of thousands of years before this moment, human beings had lived as hunters and gatherers, moving with the seasons, following herds gathering wild grain, leaving few permanent marks upon the earth. But here, in this curving cradle of rich alluvial soil, something began to change. Archaeologists point to sites like Jarmo in northern Iraq as some of the earliest evidence of this transition. At Jarmo, the remains of mud brick houses tell us that people began to settle in one place, abandoning the perpetual wandering of their ancestors. Here they cultivated barley and wheat, learning to save and sow seeds season after season. Domesticated goats, sheep, and dogs were kept close by, a quiet revolution that allowed humans to control their food supply instead of merely pursuing it. This was the Neolithic Revolution, a slow turning of the wheel that took centuries to complete. The Fertile Crescent was uniquely suited to this great transformation. Its soil, enriched by the seasonal flooding of the rivers, offered abundance. The wild ancestors of modern grains, emmer wheat and einkorn, grew naturally on its plains. The rivers provided not only water, but a natural corridor for movement, trade, and exchange of ideas. The climate was temperate enough to support sustained agriculture, yet challenging enough to encourage innovation. Irrigation canals, dikes, and early forms of water management soon followed. At sites such as Tell es-Sawwan, evidence of early irrigation has been found, channels carved by hand to guide water toward cultivated fields. These were the first stirrings of engineering, the first attempts to bend the environment toward human need. With every passing season, the link between people and land deepened. The rhythms of life became tied to the planting and harvest cycle, and with that change came new concepts: surplus, storage, and property. Clay bins stored grain for lean months. Pottery, first crude, then increasingly refined, held water, oils, and foodstuffs. It was here that the first villages emerged. Clusters of mud brick dwellings, sometimes with shared courtyards, sometimes with communal storage rooms. The dead were often buried beneath the floors of homes, a sign that these were not temporary shelters, but permanent dwellings tied to ancestry and memory. Communities grew, slowly at first, then more rapidly as agriculture supported more mouths. A tipping point was reached. Human population density began to rise in ways that had never been possible before. This new way of life brought advantages, but it also brought new challenges. Living together meant managing conflict, dividing resources, and organizing labor. Archaeologists believe that the earliest forms of social hierarchy began to emerge during this period. Some individuals likely took on roles as organizers of irrigation, keepers of surplus, mediators of disputes. The seeds of leadership, and perhaps of inequality, were sown alongside the crops. Religion, too, began to take new forms. Shrines have been found in early Neolithic villages, simple structures but clearly separate from ordinary homes. Clay figurines, perhaps of fertility goddesses, appear frequently, as do animal effigies. These were not merely practical people. They were people looking for meaning, for favor from the unseen forces that governed the floods, the rains, the fate of crops. The shift from nomadism to sedentism was not uniform. Some groups resisted it, clinging to the freedom of the hunt and the open steppe. Others may have drifted between lifestyles, seasonally moving between wild pastures and planted fields. The process took millennia and was far from inevitable. Scholars still debate why agriculture arose here first and not elsewhere. Was it climate change that pushed humans toward domestication? Was it a slow accumulation of knowledge about plants and animals that suddenly reached a critical mass? Or was it simply that the conditions of the Fertile Crescent were so uniquely conducive that the transformation could not be resisted? What is clear is that by around 6000 BCE, village life was firmly established across much of Mesopotamia. Pottery styles grew more elaborate, with painted motifs suggesting cultural identity and perhaps even early symbolic systems. Trade networks stretched outward, exchanging obsidian, shells, and precious stones. Life was no longer merely about survival. It was about building a world, and yet, with each innovation came a deeper entanglement with the land. Irrigation made crops possible in dry years, but it also demanded constant maintenance. If a canal failed, entire harvests could be lost. Settled life made people more vulnerable to raids, to disease, to the whims of weather. The very act of storing food created the possibility of theft, and thus of organized defense. Some scholars see in this period the beginnings of warfare. Fortified walls around some villages hint at a growing awareness of threat. We stand here at the threshold of history, looking into a time when humanity took its first steps toward complexity. The Fertile Crescent is no longer just a geographical region. It is a crucible. It is forging a new type of society, one that will give rise to monumental temples, to kings and priests, to writing, to law, and to empire. But in this earliest chapter, the cities are still far off on the horizon. The world remains quiet, the pace of life measured by the cycles of planting and harvest. A child wakes in a mud brick house, the smoke of a hearth curling into the dawn air. Outside, goats bleat softly. Somewhere in the distance, the river glitters in the rising sun. The first stories, the first rituals, the first whispered prayers take shape. It is tempting to think of this as a beginning, but for those who lived it, it was merely life. Life made a little easier, a little more rooted. We, looking back, call it the birth of civilization. Yet one must wonder, what was lost in this transformation? What was the cost of trading freedom for settlement, of binding human destiny to the soil? The rivers continue to flow, as they always have, silent witnesses to humanity's first grand experiment. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the first true cities are waiting, and with them, the first ziggurats, the first kings, the first great written words. The stage is being set. Civilization is about to speak. Chapter 2, Eridu, the first city, beneath the arid plains of southern Mesopotamia, where the desert winds sweep across the remnants of long-forgotten marshes, lies a place once believed to be the very beginning of civilization. Eridu, its name whispered through clay tablets and hymns, stands at the threshold between myth and history. To the Sumerians, it was not merely a settlement, but the first city, the place where kingship descended from the heavens, and where the god Enki made his dwelling. To modern archaeologists, it is a mound of sand and broken brick near the ancient shoreline of the Persian Gulf. Yet within that mound lies a layered memory of humanity's earliest steps toward urban life. The origins of Eridu reach back to around 5400 BCE, during the Ubaid period, when scattered communities of reed hut villages dotted the fertile floodplains. What sets Eridu apart is not only its age, but its continuity. Excavations have revealed at least 18 successive levels of temples, each built atop the ruins of the last. At the heart of these layers is devotion to Enki, the god of wisdom, crafts, and the life-giving freshwater believed to flow from the underworld. Each new generation raised a temple higher, as if trying to bridge the space between earth and heaven, mud and eternity. The earliest shrines were simple, built of reeds plastered with mud. echoing the environment from which the settlers drew their livelihood. But over centuries, the architecture grew more complex. Rectangular plans expanded, walls thickened, and altars appeared. By the 4th millennium BCE, Eridu's temple was no longer a modest hut, but a monumental structure of sun-dried bricks, ornamented with niches and buttresses, lifted above the plain on a platform of sacred ground. These were the prototypes of the ziggurat, the terraced towers that would later dominate the Mesopotamian skyline. Eridu's rise marks the moment humanity began to shape not just shelters, but symbols, buildings that embodied cosmic order. Around these temples, a settlement expanded. What began as a cluster of huts grew into a city of several thousand inhabitants. Canals were dug to draw water into the fields, sustaining the crops of barley and dates. Fishermen plied the marshlands, netting the bounty of the rivers, while herders brought flocks of sheep and goats to graze on the floodplains. Clay figurines, pottery painted with geometric designs, and obsidian blades testify to a growing complexity in daily life. Yet Eridu was never just about survival. Its heartbeat was ritual, its identity inseparable from the sacred presence of Enki. In Sumerian mythology, Eridu occupies a place of profound significance. The great poem known as the Sumerian King List declares that after kingship was lowered from the heavens, it first took root in Eridu. To the ancients, this was the origin point of human order, where divine authority fused with earthly governance. The Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation epic written much later, also remembers Eridu as the dwelling place of the gods, a place older than time. In these myths, we find an echo of the human memory of beginnings, a reverence for the first place where humans gathered in lasting unity. And yet, questions remain. Why here, on the shifting marshlands near the edge of the sea, did humanity take its first steps into urban life? Was it necessity, the fertile soil, the abundance of fish, the shelter of reeds? Or was it something more intangible, a collective recognition that to live together in vast numbers required a shared axis of meaning, a sacred center? In Eridu, the answer seems inseparable from religion. The city did not grow first from markets or armies, but from a temple. It was the temple that anchored the community, the temple that was rebuilt again and again, even as generations passed. The archaeological layers of Eridu reveal more than stone and brick. They reveal rhythm, the rhythm of human aspiration and continuity. Each rebuilding of the temple was an act of memory, a deliberate preservation of the sacred site. As one generation's temple crumbled, another rose in its place, as if the very earth was being consecrated by the persistence of devotion. Over nearly 2 millennia, Eridu became a palimpsest, a record of humanity's first sustained experiment in permanence. By the Uruk period, around 3500 BCE, Eridu began to wane in importance as new centers rose to dominance, most notably Uruk itself, a city that would eclipse all others in size and influence. Yet Eridu's memory lingered, preserved in hymns and myths. Even in decline, it remained a place of pilgrimage, a city of origin. Later Sumerians looked back to it with reverence, calling it the first home of kingship and the sacred seat of Enki. Its decline did not erase its meaning. Rather, it seemed to deepen the aura of mystery around it. When archaeologists uncovered Eridu in the 20th century, they did more than rediscover ruins. They unearthed the foundations of urban life itself. Excavations led by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd in the 1940s revealed the sequence of temples, each layer stacked upon the last, a material testament to the slow evolution from village to city. The finds confirmed that Eridu was among the earliest sites of monumental architecture in the world, but they also raised unsettling questions. Why did early humans, with no precedent for such scale, feel compelled to build again and again upon the same sacred ground? Was it continuity of worship, or was something deeper being preserved? An ancient covenant between the land, the people, and the gods they revered. Some scholars suggest that the myth of Eridu as the first city may carry echoes of a collective memory, passed down across centuries, of a true beginning. When scattered bands first became a people, others see in the myth a political tool used by later dynasties to claim legitimacy by linking themselves to the city of origins. Whatever the case, Eridu straddles the line between the tangible and the symbolic. It is both a mound of ruins in southern Iraq and a mythic birthplace of civilization. In the broader sweep of history, Eridu represents a threshold. Before it, humanity lived in scattered settlements, small villages bound to the cycles of subsistence. After it, the path towards cities, states, and empires had been opened. Yet the fact that Eridu's core was a temple reminds us that urbanization was never only about economy or power. It was also about meaning, about gathering around a shared axis of belief, about rooting human community in something larger than itself. As we stand in the silence of Eridu's ruins, we are confronted by layers of unanswered questions. Did the builders of these temples see themselves as creating something eternal, or were they simply repeating traditions? Unaware that they were laying the foundations of civilization, why did later generations continue to return to this place, even after other cities surpassed it? Was it nostalgia, reverence, or something even more profound? An ancient recognition that beginnings are never fully abandoned? Today, Eridu is little more than a barren tell, windswept and desolate, surrounded by empty desert. The marshes that once sustained it have receded, and the waters of the Gulf lie far to the south. Yet the site retains a quiet gravity, a sense of presence that defies its ruin. To walk upon its mound is to walk across the strata of human memory, to feel the faint pulse of the first city. In the end, Eridu invites us not to think of beginnings as sudden or absolute, but as layered and enduring. It shows us that civilization did not appear fully formed, but was patiently built, temple upon temple, generation upon generation. Its ruins whisper that the origins of cities lie not only in brick and clay, but in myth, memory, and faith. And so Eridu remains, a city half in history, half in legend, a place where the first steps towards civilization were taken, and where the gods were said to have dwelt among men. Its story does not conclude here. Rather, it fades gently into the larger current of Mesopotamian history, where other cities will rise, carrying forward the patterns first traced in its marshland soil. Chapter 3. The Ubaid Culture and Social Hierarchy. The story of civilization does not begin with Sumer. Long before the first kings of Uruk raised their ziggurats, before the first clay tablets were pressed with stylus marks, there was the Ubaid culture. A quiet yet profound chapter in the long transformation of human life. The Ubaid period, spanning roughly from 6500 to 3800 BCE, is the shadowed prelude to Mesopotamia's golden age. It is here that we see the first true outlines of complex society: irrigation canals, planned villages, and perhaps the first emergence of leaders who were more than just elders, more than just farmers among farmers. The archaeological record whispers to us through the remains of long, rectangular houses, far larger than the simple round huts of earlier times. At sites such as Eridu, Tel al-Ubaid, and al-Hiba, these long houses stand apart, often with evidence of careful construction: central halls, symmetrical rooms, sometimes built on raised platforms. Many scholars believe these were the dwellings of local leaders, or perhaps they served as early temples, places where both community gatherings and sacred rites were held. The distinction between civic and religious space may not yet have existed. Leadership and spirituality may have been one and the same. The Ubaid people were agriculturalists, but they were also engineers. They began to dig irrigation canals, channeling the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates to nourish their fields. This was no small feat. Coordinating such efforts required cooperation, perhaps even central planning, and the ability to mobilize a labor force larger than a single family or clan. It was, in a sense, the first great public work, the first step toward collective infrastructure that bound a community together. Pottery from this era is distinctive: pale clay vessels decorated with fine geometric designs in greenish paint. They are among the most beautiful artifacts of the prehistoric Near East, delicate yet practical. The distribution of this pottery across a wide region suggests a shared cultural horizon, a network of trade and exchange that stretched from northern Mesopotamia down to the Gulf. The Ubaid people were not isolated farmers. They were part of a growing tapestry of interaction, exchanging goods, ideas, and perhaps beliefs with distant communities. It is in the Ubaid period that archaeologists begin to detect the first traces of hierarchy. Burials tell a subtle story. Some graves are furnished with fine goods, beads, tools, elaborate pottery, while others are starkly simple. This differentiation hints at emerging social classes, at individuals who commanded more wealth or influence than their neighbors. The long houses, the communal irrigation systems, the growing complexity of pottery production. Together, they form a picture of a society taking its first steps toward stratification. The leaders of the Ubaid villages may have been chosen by consensus, or they may have inherited their position. Some scholars suggest that these early chiefs were also priests, mediating between the people and the gods, organizing labor not only for survival, but as acts of ritual obligation. The construction of larger buildings at sites like Eridu, considered the first true city, suggests that religion was already becoming institutionalized, with certain individuals holding special access to sacred knowledge. Eridu, in particular, stands as a symbol of this transition. Beneath the sand and clay, archaeologists have uncovered a sequence of temples built one atop the other, layer by layer over centuries. The earliest were simple mud brick structures. The later ones grew grander, standing on platforms that may have foreshadowed the great ziggurats of Sumer. These temples seem to have been dedicated to Enki, the god of fresh waters, wisdom, and creation. His presence in the earlier strata of Mesopotamian belief hints that even in the Ubaid period, the sacred had already become intertwined with the administration of life-giving water. And yet, the Ubaid culture remains enigmatic. Its language is unknown. We have no written records, no names of its leaders, no hymns or laws carved into stone. Its story comes to us only through architecture, pottery, and the arrangement of bones in graves. Was it a peaceful society, slowly growing in complexity, or were there conflicts? Clan against clan, village against village, hidden in the soil, their traces lost to time. There are hints that the Ubaid period also saw the first moves toward territorial expansion. Some settlements were placed strategically near rivers or along trade routes, as though to control movement and resources. Clay figurines from this era, with their elongated heads and stylized features, suggest a shared artistic language, perhaps even shared religious motifs. Some researchers have noted that these figurines sometimes appear in ritual contexts that may indicate concerns with fertility, protection, or power, another sign that symbolic systems were becoming more formalized. The social transformations of the Ubaid period would ripple outward through the centuries. The idea that some individuals had the right, or the duty, to direct the labor of others would not vanish. Instead, it would grow, solidify, and eventually crystallize into kingship, bureaucracy, and empire. The irrigation canals would grow more complex, the temples would rise higher, and the houses of leaders would turn into palaces. But here, in this quieter epoch, we can still imagine a world not yet fully stratified. A world where authority may still have been negotiated at the communal level, where the chief or priest may have worked alongside the people he guided. This was a time when hierarchy was still fragile, still forming, like wet clay awaiting the kiln. The Ubaid period ended not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow transformation into the Uruk period. Around 4000 BCE, the long houses and painted pottery gave way to larger, more specialized buildings and to mass-produced ceramics. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities. Whatever balance the Ubaid had achieved would soon be tested by the pressures of urbanization. And yet, standing at the edge of this transformation, we are left with haunting questions. Who were these first leaders, and what did they believe about their role? Were they chosen by the gods or by their peers? Did the people of the Ubaid see the rise of hierarchy as a gift, or as a burden? The canals they dug still lie beneath the earth, long dry. Yet their pattern remains, a ghost map of humanity's first great social experiment. The silence of the Ubaid period is almost total, and perhaps that is what gives it such power. It is a threshold, a dimly lit passage leading us from the small, scattered villages of prehistory toward the towering cities of Sumer. We pause here, in that half-light, aware that something immense is gathering just beyond the horizon. The first kings are waiting, the first laws are stirring, civilization is coming, and the world will never again be the same. Chapter 4. The Ziggurat of Uruk and Monumental Architecture. Across the windswept plains of southern Mesopotamia, where the horizon stretches unbroken beneath an endless sky, rose a city that would forever redefine what it meant to be human. Around 4000 BCE, Uruk emerged from the marshlands as more than a cluster of houses or a fortified settlement. It became the first metropolis, a place of scale and grandeur unlike anything seen before. Here, in the age now remembered as the Uruk period, architecture itself became monumental, and the built environment began to mirror cosmic order. The mud brick temples of Uruk were not merely shelters for ritual, they were statements of permanence, power, and vision. The skyline of Uruk was dominated by the White Temple, a gleaming sanctuary dedicated to Anu, the sky god, perched upon a raised platform of packed mud brick. Its stark walls reflected the light of the sun by day and caught the glow of moonlight by night. To ascend its stairways was to move symbolically from the earth toward the heavens. At its base, life unfolded in the bustle of a city that may have housed more than 40,000 inhabitants. Farmers, craftsmen, priests, and laborers who all lived under the shadow of its towering form. The construction of such a structure was an undertaking of staggering proportions. Millions of mud bricks were required, each shaped by hand and baked in the heat of the Mesopotamian sun. Archaeologists estimate that thousands of workers must have labored in coordinated effort, hauling earth, shaping bricks, and erecting walls that rose ever higher. This was not an achievement of chance, but of organization. It demanded central authority, careful planning, and the mobilization of a population under a shared vision. Here, we glimpse the first stirrings of something that would define Mesopotamian civilization for millennia, the union of religious devotion with political power. Uruk's ziggurat, an early precursor to the stepped towers that would later rise across Mesopotamia, was more than an architectural marvel. It was a visible axis mundi, a bridge between the human and the divine. At its summit, priests performed rituals to secure the favor of the gods, while below, the city's inhabitants worked, traded, and lived their lives in the temple's shadow. The very act of building such a structure reaffirmed the hierarchy of the world. The gods above, their chosen intermediaries in the temple, and the people gathered beneath. Yet one must ask, what compelled a still young civilization to pour so much energy into structures of such scale? Was it fear? The need to appease the gods who controlled the floods, the harvests, and the fragile balance of life? Was it power? A demonstration by rulers that they alone could command the labor and resources of thousands? Or was it something deeper still? A human longing to create permanence in a world of shifting rivers and encroaching desert? The White Temple of Anu is only one example of Uruk's monumental ambition. Elsewhere in the city, the Iana precinct flourished as a sprawling complex dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love and war. Here, archaeologists have uncovered an astonishing array of structures, temples, courts, and halls, many built upon raised terraces that foreshadowed later ziggurats. The Iana complex speaks of a city not only concerned with religious ritual, but also with administration, craft production, and ceremony. Together, these sacred precincts reveal how closely the sacred and the civic were intertwined in the life of Uruk. The sheer scale of Uruk's architecture required innovations in both materials and organization. Mud brick was the medium of choice, abundant yet fragile. To give it strength, builders experimented with techniques, mixing straw into the clay, firing bricks for durability, and arranging them in intricate patterns that distributed weight. Some walls were decorated with cone mosaics, colored clay cones pressed into the plaster in geometric designs that caught the eye with subtle glimmers of red, black, and white. These details remind us that monumental architecture was not only functional, but also aesthetic, an attempt to embody beauty as well as authority. In mobilizing such projects, Uruk reveals the emergence of centralized power. The coordination of thousands of laborers could not have occurred without leadership and administration. Here we see the earliest traces of bureaucracy, clay tablets recording rations of grain for workers, tallies of bricks produced, lists of goods collected and distributed. Writing itself may have first emerged in this context, as a tool to manage the complexities of monumental construction and the growing city around it. In the shadows of the White Temple, the first cuneiform signs were pressed into clay, capturing the pulse of the city in symbols that would endure long after Uruk's decline. But even as these records give us glimpses of administration, they leave the human dimension largely silent. What was it like to labor beneath the Mesopotamian sun, day after day, raising a structure whose scale few could fully comprehend? Did the workers see themselves as serving the gods, or as serving the will of rulers who claimed divine mandate? Were they compelled by force, or did they share in a collective vision of a city blessed by the divine? Archaeology cannot fully answer, yet the immensity of these projects suggests that belief and authority were deeply intertwined, each brick a physical testament to human devotion and human power. Uruk's monumental architecture was not isolated achievement. It radiated influence across Mesopotamia and beyond. The ziggurat form, pioneered here, spread outward, replicated in cities like Ur, Nippur, and Babylon. The idea of raising a sacred temple upon a massive platform became a defining characteristic of Mesopotamian urban life. It also resonated with myth. Later traditions remembered the gods themselves as descending upon these sacred towers, the ziggurats standing as ladders between heaven and earth. Some have even seen in these traditions the distant echo of the biblical Tower of Babel, a mythic memory of humanity's audacious attempt to build toward the divine. To stand before the ruins of Uruk today is to face the fragility of mud brick, eroded and weathered by time. The White Temple itself survives only as a faint outline upon its platform, its gleaming walls long vanished. Yet even in ruin, the site carries weight. The raised terraces, the outlines of colossal walls, the traces of cone mosaics, all speak of a time when architecture was no longer temporary but monumental, when human beings first sought to anchor themselves in permanence. Uruk's ziggurats remind us that the story of civilization is as much about aspiration as it is about survival. To build so high, so wide, and with such ambition was to declare that humanity was no longer content to live within the cycles of nature alone. The city became a world unto itself, organized around sacred centers that both reflected and enforced cosmic order. The gods were enthroned above, the rulers below, and the people arrayed beneath, each bound to the other by the bricks of the temple. Yet the mystery endures. Why, at this early stage, did humanity choose monumentality? Was it an instinctive recognition that meaning requires form, that belief requires architecture? Or was it an assertion of control, a declaration of dominion over both earth and spirit? Perhaps it was both. In the ziggurats of Uruk, we see the fusion of faith and power, myth and material, eternity and clay. The city of Uruk would rise to legendary heights, remembered in the Epic of Gilgamesh as a place of mighty walls and sacred precincts, the first true city of the world. Its ziggurats, though diminished by time, still echo that memory. They whisper of a turning point when humanity first looked upward, not only to the stars, but through the architecture of its own hands. And as the dust settles over the ruins, one cannot help but wonder, did the builders of Uruk believe they had touched eternity? Or did they know, even then, that mud brick would one day crumble, leaving only fragments and memory behind? Chapter 5. The invention of writing at Uruk in the southern plains of Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates wound through reeds and marshlands, there rose a city unlike any that had existed before, Uruk. By 3200 BCE, Uruk had become a thriving center of trade, administration, and religious devotion. It was here, in the temple precincts of this city, that something extraordinary was born, a technology that would change the human relationship with time itself. On small, flat pieces of clay, marks began to appear. At first, they were simple impressions, pictographs that could be easily understood. A circle for a sheep, a wedge for a jar of oil, a line to indicate a measure of grain. They were used to keep track of goods moving in and out of the great temple storehouses. Sheep were counted, barley weighed, beer rations distributed. It was an age of growing complexity, and memory alone could no longer bear the burden of keeping order. These tablets, pressed with a stylus made of reed, were humanity's first attempt to anchor information outside the human mind. The earliest tablets from Uruk were not intended as literature. They were ledgers, cold, methodical records of the temple economy. Archaeologists call this first system proto-cuneiform, a writing not yet fully detached from its pictorial origins. The signs were largely ideograms, pictures representing things. A stylized head of an ox meant ox, a jar meant beer. But as the centuries passed, the system grew more abstract. Signs began to stand for sounds rather than just objects, allowing scribes to write not only lists, but eventually names, actions, even thoughts. The discovery of these tablets in the late 19th and early 20th centuries stunned archaeologists. At the site known as Uruk IV, thousands of clay tablets were found in the ruins of what was likely a temple complex. Their contents were overwhelmingly administrative. Lists of offerings to the gods, allocations of grain, tallies of laborers. But they revealed a society of staggering organization. The temple was not merely a place of worship. It was the beating heart of Uruk's economy, a center for redistribution where farmers brought their harvests and from which rations were given to workers, priests, and artisans. This administrative need may have been the spark that lit the fire of writing, but its implications were far-reaching. For the first time, human speech could be preserved beyond the moment it was uttered. A transaction could be verified days or months later. Orders could be sent to distant fields and outposts. Authority could extend beyond the presence of the person giving it. The world had changed. The script itself was evolving rapidly. Around 3100 BCE, scribes began to rotate their pictographs, pressing them into clay with the angled tip of the reed stylus. This produced the characteristic wedge-shaped marks from which cuneiform takes its name. Cuneus, Latin for wedge. Over time, the pictures became stylized, reduced to clusters of wedges and lines. What had once been a picture of a fish became a simple set of impressions, instantly recognizable to the trained eye. Writing was becoming faster, more standardized, and more versatile. The training required to master this new system was extensive. Young scribes likely spent years learning the complex repertoire of signs. Archaeologists have uncovered practice tablets showing students copying symbols over and over, sometimes making mistakes, sometimes adding small doodles. These tablets, often discarded in heaps, are the first traces of formal education, schools where knowledge was transmitted not just orally, but through this new medium. But was writing merely a tool of commerce, or did it hold something more? Scholars have long debated whether proto-cuneiform was used for myth and ritual during its earliest stages. While the majority of surviving tablets are administrative, there are tantalizing signs that religious concepts were encoded very early on. Lists of offerings to deities, records of temple staff, and inventories of ritual objects suggest that the sacred and the economic were deeply entwined. The temple was both granary and holy site, and its scribes served both the gods and the community. It is likely that the first myths were transmitted orally for centuries before being committed to clay. The gods of Uruk, Inanna, Anu, Enki, were already central to Mesopotamian life. Perhaps the first written words to describe them were not narratives but simple lists. Which god received, which offering, on which day, in which quantity. In this way, writing may have emerged not just as a tool of bureaucracy, but as an instrument of cosmic order, keeping the balance between human society and the divine. With writing came the possibility of record keeping beyond the living memory of a single generation. Histories could be remembered, genealogies preserved, contracts enforced long after the witnesses had passed away. Writing became a vehicle of power. Whoever controlled the written word controlled the story of the harvest, of the temple, of the king. This was not just a leap forward in communication. It was a leap forward in the very concept of authority. The clay tablets of Uruk also hint at the beginnings of literature, though in a very rudimentary form. Some tablets contain lexical lists, collections of signs grouped by category, such as types of animals, professions, or tools. These lists were used to train scribes, but also preserved cultural knowledge, codifying the Mesopotamian understanding of the world. The very act of listing was a way of imposing order, of cataloguing creation, of saying, this is what exists, and here is how it is named. One cannot help but sense a quiet wonder at this threshold moment. To sit in the dusty courtyard of Uruk, read stylus in hand, and press a mark into wet clay, was to make a permanent impression not just on the tablet, but on time itself. It was to declare that a thought, a transaction, a word should endure beyond the fleeting breath that spoke it. Writing was humanity's first great defiance of forgetting, and yet, as powerful as it was, this new skill was not for everyone. Literacy was likely limited to a small group: scribes, priests, administrators, those who served the temple or palace. For the majority of the population, life remained oral, stories still told by firelight, news carried by the voice of a messenger. Writing was an elite technology, a gatekeeper of knowledge that could include or exclude, empower or control. Even now, over 5,000 years later, the tablets of Uruk speak to us. Their wedge-shaped marks, once so cryptic, have been painstakingly deciphered by generations of scholars. They tell us of beer rations for workers, of sheep counted by the dozens, of land allotted to temple staff. They are mundane records, yet they are also the first sentences of history. And still, questions linger. Was writing born solely to manage grain and labor? Or was there a deeper impulse at work? a desire to capture the stories of gods and heroes, to anchor memory against the eroding currents of time. Were there tablets of myth, of poetry, of prophecy that have crumbled away in the long centuries between then and now? The city of Uruk would continue to grow, its temples rising higher, its writing becoming ever more sophisticated. Soon, kings would carve their names into stone, victories would be proclaimed, and the first great epic would be committed to clay. But here, in the quiet halls of the temple storehouses, writing was still young, still finding its voice. The last light of the day falls across the clay tablets, drying in the sun. Somewhere nearby, a scribe sets down his stylus, his work complete. He cannot know that in pressing these marks, he has opened a door that can never be closed, the door to history itself. Beyond this threshold lies literature, law, and empire. Beyond this threshold, humanity has begun to speak to eternity. Chapter 6. The Epic of Gilgamesh and Sumerian Literature. Amid the ruins of Mesopotamia, buried beneath centuries of silence, there emerged a voice from the world's first great city. It was not a temple, nor a ziggurat, but a story, a tale pressed into clay, carrying across millennia the memory of a king who became a legend. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving epic poem known to humankind, a literary monument that outlasted the mud brick walls and vanished palaces of Uruk. Through its verses, we hear both myth and memory, the struggle of a man who sought to defy death, and the timeless echo of human longing for meaning beyond the grave. The rediscovery of Gilgamesh's story was itself an epic of modern archaeology. In the mid-19th century, British excavators working at Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, uncovered the vast library of King Ashurbanipal. Within it lay thousands of clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform. Many were shattered, scattered in fragments, but when pieced together they revealed hymns, laws, rituals, and most astonishing of all, an epic poem about a king of Uruk. It was here that the name Gilgamesh rose from obscurity, carried once more into the light of history after being forgotten for over 2,000 years. The poem itself is a patchwork of voices, assembled from earlier Sumerian tales that celebrated Gilgamesh as both ruler and demigod. The earliest fragments date as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE, written in Sumerian. These independent stories of Gilgamesh and the wild man Enkidu, of the cedar forest, of the great flood, were later woven together in Akkadian, forming the unified epic we know today. What survives comes from multiple versions, the most complete preserved on 11 tablets from Nineveh, with a 12th tablet appended from older traditions. The text is incomplete, scarred by time, yet the themes it carries are whole and enduring. At the heart of the epic is Gilgamesh himself, described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He is portrayed as a mighty king of Uruk, a builder of walls, yet also a tyrant whose arrogance oppresses his people. In response, the gods create Enkidu, a wild man of the steppe, to challenge him. Their rivalry turns to friendship, and together they embark on heroic quests, slaying Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, defeating the bull of heaven sent by the goddess Ishtar, and reveling in the glory of their deeds. Yet victory leads to tragedy. The gods decree that Enkidu must die, and his death plunges Gilgamesh into grief so profound that it awakens in him the fear of his own mortality. From this grief begins a journey that transcends kingship. Gilgamesh wanders the wilderness, seeking the secret of eternal life. He travels to the ends of the earth, through mountains and seas, until he encounters Utnapishtim, the survivor of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. In Utnapishtim's tale, we hear one of the earliest flood narratives, a story that bears striking resemblance to later traditions, including the biblical account of Noah. Yet even here, Gilgamesh finds no lasting reprieve. He learns that death is inescapable, that eternal life belongs only to the gods. The epic ends with Gilgamesh returning to Uruk, gazing upon its mighty walls, and recognizing that his true legacy lies not in immortality, but in what he built for his people. The themes woven through the epic are as enduring as the clay upon which they were inscribed. Friendship and loss, power and humility, the inevitability of death. These are not merely Sumerian concerns, but human ones. Gilgamesh's grief for Enkidu reads as vividly today as it must have 4,000 years ago. His futile quest for immortality speaks to a longing that has haunted every age, the desire to transcend the limits of flesh, to find permanence in a transient world. Yet the poem is not only a story of one man's struggle, it is also a window into the culture that birthed it. In its verses, we glimpse the worldview of ancient Mesopotamia, a cosmos ruled by capricious gods, a society where kingship was divine yet fragile, and a landscape haunted by the threat of flood and drought. Through Gilgamesh, we see how the Sumerians wrestled with the tension between human ambition and divine decree. Scholars continue to debate the historicity of Gilgamesh. The Sumerian king list, an ancient chronicle of rulers, names Gilgamesh as the fifth king of Uruk, reigning sometime around 2800 BCE. Some argue he was a real ruler, later mythologized into a semi-divine hero. Others see him as a purely symbolic figure, a composite embodying the ideals and anxieties of Sumerian kingship. The truth may lie somewhere between. A historical king whose memory was reshaped across generations until fact and legend became indistinguishable. What is certain is the influence his story wielded. The epic resonated across Mesopotamia, retold and reinterpreted through centuries. Its motifs, heroic friendship, divine punishment, the Great Flood, echoed in later cultures. The parallels between Utnapishtim's flood and biblical tradition are perhaps the most striking, suggesting shared memories or cultural transmissions that link the ancient Near East. In this way, Gilgamesh's story became part of humanity's broader mythic inheritance, a voice carried into texts far removed from Uruk's walls. The materiality of the epic is itself a marvel. To hold a fragment of a clay tablet from Nineveh is to touch the words of scribes who lived 3,000 years ago, preserving a tale already ancient in their time, each wedge-shaped impression of the stylus fixed words into matter, anchoring memory in clay. Unlike the fragile papyrus of Egypt or the perishable hides of other lands, these tablets endured the centuries, buried in earth until their rediscovery. Their survival feels almost miraculous, as if the story itself resisted oblivion. And yet, despite its endurance, the epic is incomplete. Entire passages are missing, lost in broken tablets. Sentences fragment into silence, leaving us to imagine what once filled the gaps. Perhaps this is fitting. Just as Gilgamesh's quest ends not with immortality but with acceptance of mortality, so too the poem survives not as a whole, but as fragments, reminding us that even the greatest stories are subject to time. The Epic of Gilgamesh is often called the first great work of literature, but it is more than that. It is a mirror, reflecting back at us the continuity of human experience. The Sumerians who first recited these verses, the Akkadian scribes who pressed them into clay, the Assyrian kings who preserved them in libraries, all shared the same questions that still stir within us. What does it mean to live? What endures when we are gone? Can friendship, love, or legacy defy the silence of death? In the shadow of Uruk's vanished ziggurats, the figure of Gilgamesh still walks. He is the restless king who sought to conquer death and returned only with wisdom. He is the friend who wept, the seeker who wandered, the builder who gazed upon the walls of his city and found solace in their endurance. His story, carved in clay, remains one of humanity's oldest testaments to our own impermanence, and so the tablets speak across broken centuries, reminding us that kings fall, cities fade, and walls crumble. But words, fragile as they are, can sometimes outlast stone. What began in Uruk, on the lips of storytellers by firelight, continues to whisper still, carrying forward the oldest dream of all. Chapter 7. Cylinder seals and Sumerian bureaucracy. Among the most enchanting artifacts of ancient Mesopotamia are objects so small they could fit in the palm of a hand, yet they bear worlds upon their surfaces. These are the cylinder seals, tiny carved stones that, when rolled across wet clay, left behind a continuous impression, like a miniature tapestry. At first glance, they are beautiful works of art. Look closer, and they reveal a society deeply invested in order, ownership, and the watchful gaze of the divine. Cylinder seals first appeared during the late Uruk period, around 3500 BCE, alongside the earliest tablets. Their emergence was no coincidence. As the temple economy of Uruk became increasingly complex, record-keeping needed an equally sophisticated system of verification. A seal was more than decoration. It was a tool of identity and authority. When pressed into clay, it authenticated a document, sealed a jar, or closed a storeroom. Its impression told anyone who saw it, "This transaction is official. This property is under my protection. This action has been sanctioned." The seals were typically made from hard stones, lapis lazuli, serpentine, hematite, meticulously drilled and incised with intricate designs. Their cylindrical form allowed them to roll, leaving a repeating pattern in the soft clay. The impression could encircle the surface of a tablet or create a secure closure on a lump of clay used to seal a door or container. In this way, the seal functioned like a signature, a personal emblem that represented the owner in their absence. What makes these objects so captivating is their imagery. The earliest seals display simple geometric patterns or animals, but soon they evolved into detailed scenes. We see banquet gatherings, where figures sit before overflowing vessels, drinking through long straws. Perhaps elite feasts or sacred rituals. We see processions of animals, sometimes led by human figures, suggesting offerings to the gods. We see mythological scenes, divine heroes grappling with lions or bulls, solar deities standing with radiant staffs, priestly figures in acts of worship. These scenes are more than decorative. They are ideological. The Sumerians viewed their world as one governed by cosmic order. The gods had established the boundaries of life, when to plant and harvest, whom to obey, what justice required, and humans maintained this order through ritual and law. The cylinder seals, then, are windows into this worldview. Each impression, no matter how small, reinforced a narrative of balance, hierarchy, and divine sanction. For example, one common motif is the contest scene, where a hero or god grapples with a wild animal. This image symbolizes the triumph of civilization over chaos, a reminder that society itself is a bulwark against the forces of disorder. Another frequent image is the banquet scene, which may have been linked to the sacred meals offered to deities or to elite feasting that mirrored the gods' own divine banquets. By carrying such imagery, the seal owner was aligning themselves with this cosmic drama, proclaiming their role as a participant in maintaining harmony between heaven and earth. The craftsmanship of these seals is astonishing, especially considering their scale. Some measure barely an inch in height, yet display complex compositions with multiple figures, animals, and symbols. The artisans who carved them were masters of miniaturization, working with tools so fine that individual strands of hair or folds of clothing can sometimes be discerned. For archaeologists, these objects are invaluable, providing insights into fashion, furniture, ritual implements, and even musical instruments otherwise lost to time. Cylinder seals also speak to the rise of bureaucracy. Each seal impression acted as a kind of official stamp, turning an otherwise anonymous tablet into a document tied to a specific individual or office. In some cases, seals were used to lock storerooms or containers. The intact seal impression proved that no one had tampered with the contents. Breaking the seal was not only a physical act, but a legal one, a declaration that the contents were being accessed with permission. The existence of so many seals, thousands have been found across Mesopotamia, suggests a society where administrative control was pervasive. Farmers bringing grain to the temple might have their deliveries recorded on a tablet, sealed with an official's mark. A shipment of goods traveling to another city might be accompanied by a sealed tag listing its contents. In this way, the seal was both a guarantor of trust and a symbol of surveillance. It told everyone that the eyes of the temple, and by extension, the gods, were watching. There is also a personal dimension to these objects. A cylinder seal was often worn on a cord around the neck or wrist, functioning as a kind of signature ring. Losing one could have been disastrous, much like losing an identity card or personal stamp today. Some seals were buried with their owners, perhaps as a mark of status or a tool for use in the afterlife. Others were passed down through generations, becoming family heirlooms and symbols of continuity. The iconography of seals also evolved over time. In later periods, we see more narrative complexity, with scenes that may reflect specific myths or stories. Some scholars believe certain seal designs correspond to early versions of Mesopotamian epics, long before they were written down. If this is true, then cylinder seals were not only administrative tools, but also vessels of storytelling, condensing cosmic narratives into a few square centimeters of stone. What do these recurring motifs reveal about the Sumerian mind? Above all, they show a culture that sought to bind the practical to the sacred. Administration was not merely economic, it was theological. To weigh grain or tally sheep was to participate in the god's plan for order. To press one's seal into clay was to make an impression not only on the material world, but on the moral order of the cosmos. Today, when we roll a cylinder seal's impression into soft clay in a museum demonstration, we are momentarily connected to that ancient sensibility. We reenact an act that 5,000 years ago affirmed identity, guaranteed trust, and invoked divine witness. The impression left behind is delicate but enduring, a message across millennia, whispering of a people who understood that every transaction, every act of ownership, every agreement was part of a greater, divinely watched order. In the end, cylinder seals are more than artifacts. They are signatures of a civilization, evidence that the Sumerians saw life itself as something to be ordered, recorded, and blessed. Each rolled scene is a reminder that in ancient Mesopotamia, bureaucracy was never just about paperwork. It was about aligning human society with the eternal decrees of the gods. Would you like me to include specific archaeological examples of famous cylinder seals, e.g., the presentation scene seals from Uruk or the early dynastic period, to make the chapter feel more grounded and vivid? Chapter 8. The Rise of Akkad and the First Empire. In the long shadows of Mesopotamia's early cities, where Sumer's ziggurats still caught the rising sun, a new power stirred. Around 2334 BCE, the fragmented city-states of the south, Uruk, Lagash, and others, were drawn into the orbit of a single man, a figure who would transform the political landscape of the ancient Near East. His name was Sargon of Akkad. To later generations, he became more than a king. He was remembered as the first true emperor, the one who bound the patchwork of Mesopotamia into a single dominion, projecting power farther than any ruler before him. His was a reign of conquest, organization, and myth, an empire that blazed briefly but brightly before dissolving back into the sands of history. The story of Sargon's rise begins in obscurity. According to later inscriptions, he was born the son of a humble cupbearer, abandoned in a reed basket on the river, raised by a gardener, and chosen by the goddess Ishtar for greatness. Whether fact or legend, the narrative casts him as a figure of destiny, an outsider who rose from nothing to command the known world. What can be traced in history is his ascent within the city of Kish, where he served as cupbearer to the king. From this position, he seized opportunity, overthrowing his master and establishing himself as ruler. In time, he moved the seat of power to a new capital, Akkad, a city whose precise location has never been identified, and whose mystery still haunts archaeology. From Akkad, Sargon unleashed a series of campaigns that reshaped the map of Mesopotamia. Inscriptions speak of his victories over the Sumerian city-states, each of which had long resisted domination by its neighbors. By force and by strategy, he subdued Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Umma, consolidating them into his rule. But Sargon's ambitions reached beyond Sumer. His armies marched north along the Tigris and Euphrates, extending control into northern Mesopotamia and beyond. He claimed to have reached the upper Sea and Lower Sea, the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, stretching his dominion from one horizon to the other. The Akkadian Empire was not merely an expansion of territory. It represented a new kind of political order, the deliberate unification of diverse lands and peoples under a single central authority. To maintain this vast realm, Sargon appointed trusted officials, many drawn from his own family. His daughter, Enheduanna, was installed as high priestess of the moon god Nana in Ur, a role that blended religious prestige with political control. Through her hymns and poetry, some of the earliest known authored texts in history, she affirmed both her father's divine legitimacy and the cultural unity of the empire. The figure of Enheduanna offers us a rare glimpse into the voices of Akkad. Her compositions, inscribed on clay, praise Inanna with language of awe and power. They also reveal the political function of literature and religion in sustaining imperial rule. Through sacred poetry, the empire wove its presence into the spiritual fabric of Sumerian life. The pen and the sword moved together, binding people not only by force, but also by story. Sargon himself became the subject of stories that magnified his aura. Later, Akkadian and Babylonian texts portrayed him as invincible, marching through 24 campaigns, ruling for more than 50 years, and commanding armies of over 5,000 men. He was celebrated as the shepherd of his people, chosen by the gods, yet feared for his relentless ambition. Archaeological fragments, stone steles, inscriptions, statues give us partial glimpses of this man who stood at the turning point of history, half shrouded in myth, half anchored in fact. The legacy of Akkad's empire also lies in the language it spread. Akkadian, once the tongue of a small Semitic-speaking people, became the lingua franca of the ancient Near East. For centuries after the fall of the empire, Akkadian remained the language of administration, diplomacy, and literature. It supplanted Sumerian as the everyday language, though Sumerian endured as a sacred and scholarly tongue. In this way, the empire's influence outlasted its political life, embedding itself into the very words of the region. But empires rise and empires fall. The Akkadian state, despite its power, endured for scarcely more than a century. By the reigns of Sargon's grandsons, cracks had begun to appear. Texts from the later period describe rebellions across the land, cities rising against Akkad's authority. Foreign invasions compounded the pressure, most notably from the Gutians, a people of the Zagros Mountains, who poured into Mesopotamia and disrupted its fragile order. The once dominant empire began to fragment, its authority dissolving like water into desert sand. Some scholars have suggested that climate change played a decisive role in Akkad's collapse. Geological evidence points to a prolonged period of drought around 2200 BCE, part of a larger event sometimes called the 4.2 kiloyear event. Across the Near East, rainfall declined, rivers dwindled, and agricultural yields plummeted. For an empire dependent on the fragile balance of irrigation and grain, such environmental stress may have been catastrophic. Famines would have fueled unrest, undermining both the economy and the legitimacy of rulers. In this light, the fall of Akkad appears not only as a political collapse, but as part of a broader ecological crisis. Whatever the cause, Akkad's end came swiftly. The Gutians established dominance over Mesopotamia for a time, remembered in Sumerian texts as a dark age of disorder and decline. Yet even in their fall, the Akkadians left a legacy that could not be erased. Later kings looked back to Sargon as the model of empire. The rulers of Babylon and Assyria traced their authority to him, seeing in his example the archetype of universal kingship. His name became a symbol of imperial ambition, echoed in the myths and chronicles of centuries to come. The ruins of Akkad itself remain hidden, its capital lost to the shifting earth. Archaeologists have searched for its location, scanning maps and tells, but its true site eludes discovery. Perhaps it lies buried beneath the alluvium of the Euphrates, waiting for spade or satellite to reveal it. The absence of the city is a reminder that even the mightiest centers of power can vanish utterly, leaving only fragments of inscriptions to whisper their story. The rise and fall of Akkad stand as a turning point in human history. Here, for the first time, city-states were drawn together into a single empire, a vision of unity sustained through both force and faith. And here too, we see the fragility of such ambition, the way climate, geography, and human resistance can unravel the grandest designs. Sargon of Akkad set a pattern that would echo across millennia, yet his empire endured for only a moment in the vast expanse of time. As we listen to the voices of clay tablets and the silence of vanished walls, we are left with questions that cannot be fully answered. Was the fall of Akkad inevitable, a natural consequence of overreach, or was it the cruelty of climate? A reminder of humanity's dependence on forces beyond control? Did the people of Akkad sense, in their final days, that they were living at the end of an age? The answers lie buried, half in legend, half in earth. Yet the memory of Akkad persists, not as a ruin we can see, but as an idea, the first empire, the first vision of unity. Its story drifts between history and myth, a reminder of both the heights humanity can achieve and the fragility that shadows all ambition. Chapter 9. The Curse of Akkad. A lost age. In the silence of clay tablets, we hear the lament of a fallen empire. The Akkadian Empire, forged by the ambitions of Sargon of Akkad around 23 and 34 BCE, was the first to unite the cities of Mesopotamia under a single rule. It was a dazzling achievement. Canals and roads stretched across the land. Trade reached far beyond the twin rivers, and imperial administrators kept record of everything from grain harvests to temple offerings. And yet, within just a few generations, this empire collapsed, leaving behind ruins, scattered records, and one of the most haunting works of ancient literature ever written, the Curse of Akkad. This Sumerian lamentation, composed centuries after Akkad's fall, tells of a cosmic judgment. According to the text, the gods turned against the Akkadian kings. The city of Akkad, once favored, became cursed. Enlil, the chief deity of the Mesopotamian pantheon, withdrew his blessing, and the land was struck by calamity. Crops withered, fields became dust, and famine stalked the people. Raiders swept across the land, and the once great capital was abandoned to the desert winds. For the ancient scribes who wrote and preserved this text, Akkad's downfall was no ordinary event. It was framed as a moral turning point in history. The story names Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson and the empire's most celebrated king, as the one who angered the gods. Naram-Sin had dared to march against the city of Nippur, the sacred seat of Enlil's temple. In some versions, he even destroyed the temple itself. For this act of hubris, divine retribution fell upon Akkad. The empire's fall was thus portrayed as a lesson. No ruler, however mighty, could defy the gods and escape their judgment. The historical reality is more complex. Archaeologists and historians point to multiple possible causes for Akkad's decline. Evidence from sediment cores suggests a period of severe drought struck the Near East around 2200 BCE, a shifting climate so extreme it has been called the 4.2 kiloyear event. Crops would have failed, irrigation systems dried up, and the once fertile plains turned to dust. At the same time, pressure from external groups, often identified as the Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains, destabilized the empire's borders. The combined force of environmental stress, internal rebellion, and outside invasions may have brought the Akkadian state to its knees. And yet, the text of the Curse of Akkad does not speak of weather patterns or shifting populations. It speaks of divine anger, of sin and punishment. Its language is mournful, almost liturgical. For the first time since cities were founded, the fields gave no grain, the rivers gave no fish, clouds gave no rain. Each line is a dirge for a world undone, a world in which human wrongdoing shattered the harmony between heaven and earth. This merging of history with theology tells us something profound about how ancient Mesopotamians understood time. For them, events were not random. Catastrophe was never meaningless. When empires fell, it was because cosmic order had been disturbed. Kings were not just rulers, they were custodians of divine balance. Naram-Sin's alleged attack on Nippur was therefore more than a military act. It was a breach in the cosmic fabric, an offense that demanded correction. Some scholars have wondered whether the Curse of Akkad was less a historical record and more a political weapon. By the time it was written, Akkad had long vanished, and Sumerian city-states were again competing for dominance. The scribes of Lagash, Ur, or Uruk may have shaped the memory of Akkad's fall to serve their own ideological purposes, turning history into a warning against centralized imperial power. In this reading, the curse becomes propaganda, a story crafted to remind future kings of the danger of overreaching ambition. Others see in the text an authentic echo of real suffering. Archaeological surveys of northern Mesopotamia reveal widespread abandonment of settlements around this period. Entire villages were left behind as their inhabitants moved south or perished. Clay tablets from later periods speak of famine so severe that parents sold their children for grain. Whether or not Naram-Sin truly sacked Nippur, the experience of collapse was seared into the collective memory of the region. The very act of writing the Curse of Akkad may have been a way of processing trauma. In giving the disaster a cause, divine displeasure, the scribes offered a framework that made sense of the chaos. It was not merely that the rains failed, or that invaders came. It was that the people had strayed from the path of the gods. Repentance, humility, and renewed devotion could, in theory, restore order. In this sense, the text is both a lament and a ritual of healing. Even today, there is something hauntingly familiar about this story. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall. We search for reasons, sometimes in data and climate models, sometimes in morality tales. We tell ourselves that decline is the price of arrogance, that catastrophe is a warning. Perhaps this is part of what makes the Curse of Akkad so enduring. It is not only the lament of a single lost city, but a reflection of the universal human fear that prosperity can vanish in an instant, that the world we build is always fragile. The ruins of Akkad itself have never been definitively identified. Its location remains a mystery, hidden beneath centuries of silt and shifting riverbeds. Archaeologists continue to search for it, combing the desert north of Babylon, hoping to find the city that once ruled all of Mesopotamia. Each fragment of inscription, each seal impression, each layer of collapsed wall is a clue. But Akkad's silence remains, as if the city itself has chosen to keep its secret, a ghost in the historical record. And so, we are left with the words of the lament. We imagine the scribes in their dimly lit rooms, pressing reed stylus to clay, line after line, preserving the memory of an empire's undoing. We imagine the priests reciting these words during rituals, asking the gods to turn their faces back toward the people. And we imagine the last citizens of Akkad, leaving their city behind, turning to look one final time before the desert claimed it forever. The curse of Akkad is, in the end, more than a text. It is a mirror held up to the cycles of history, a reminder that even the mightiest powers can fall, and that every generation must reckon with the question of why. Was Akkad's fall a divine judgment, a cautionary tale shaped by later hands, or simply the result of forces beyond anyone's control? The tablets do not answer. They only whisper in their cracked and ancient lines of a lost age when kings defied the heavens and paid the price. And perhaps, in that whisper, there is a message meant not only for the past, but for us, that civilizations are fragile things, and that the favor of heaven, once withdrawn, is not easily regained. Chapter 10. The Neo-Sumerian Renaissance. At Ur-III, when the dust of Akkad's empire settled, and the Gutian interlude faded into memory, a new dawn rose upon the southern plains of Mesopotamia. Around 2112 BCE, in the city of Ur, a dynasty emerged that sought not only to reclaim the heritage of Sumer, but to reimagine it. The rulers of what we now call the Ur-III period cast themselves as restorers of order after centuries of chaos. Their project was not merely political, it was cultural, spiritual, and architectural. A conscious revival of Sumerian traditions layered with new forms of power. The age of Ur-Nammu and his successors stands as one of the most luminous chapters in early Mesopotamian history. A brief renaissance where temples rose again. Laws were written in stone, and bureaucracy etched the rhythms of life into clay. Ur-Nammu, founder of the dynasty, seized power at a moment when Mesopotamia was fragmented. The collapse of Akkad had left the land divided among small city-states, each vulnerable to incursions from the Zagros and the Western Steppe. By force of arms and careful alliances, Ur-Nammu unified the south. But he did more than conquer, he built. His reign initiated an architectural vision that reshaped the skyline of Sumer. Most iconic was his great ziggurat at Ur, a towering terraced pyramid dedicated to the moon god Nana, patron of the city. Rising in massive steps from the plain, the ziggurat was constructed from millions of mud bricks, faced with baked bricks set in bitumen. Its core was solid, designed to endure, and its stairways climbed upward like paths to the heavens. In this structure, archaeologists see one of the clearest statements of Mesopotamian cosmology, a bridge between the earth below and the divine realms above. But Ur-Nammu's legacy was not only monumental, he also left behind one of the earliest known legal codes in history. Inscribed on tablets and fragments, the Code of Ur-Nammu predates the more famous laws of Hammurabi by centuries. Written in Sumerian, it prescribed fines and compensations rather than the harsher physical punishments that would characterize later codes. In its lines, we glimpse the principles of a society seeking order, laws concerning theft, injury, marriage, and property. Each case suggests a ruler who sought to regulate daily life, balancing justice with pragmatism. Though incomplete, the fragments remind us that the written law itself was an innovation of immense significance, a way to bind community, not only through custom but through codified decree. The empire of Ur-III was as much a bureaucracy as it was a monarchy. From this period survived tens of thousands of clay tablets, the vast archives of an administrative machine unparalleled in earlier Mesopotamia. These records capture the minutiae of life with astonishing clarity. They list rations of grain given to workers, taxes collected from provinces, rotations of labor crews assigned to temples or canals. They note offerings made to the gods, distributions of beer, and tallies of livestock. Some tablets record payments to foreign mercenaries, others the delivery of reeds, fish, or wool. In these humble documents lies the heartbeat of an empire, each wedge-shaped sign a trace of human effort, carefully calculated, accounted, and preserved. To modern scholars, these tablets are a revelation. They open a window not only onto kings and conquests, but onto shepherds, brewers, scribes, and brickmakers. They show a society deeply organized, where temple and state worked in tandem to direct resources. Canals were dredged, harvests planned, and armies provisioned with an efficiency that suggests remarkable centralization. At its height, the Ur-3 state governed a realm that stretched across southern Mesopotamia and reached into the Elamite highlands. It was a vision of order, meticulously planned, an echo perhaps of Akkad's ambition, but distinctly Sumerian in its cultural revival. Yet within this system, we sense tension. The tablets speak not only of rations and duties, but also of control. Labor was rotated in corvée, compelling communities to supply workers for state projects. Taxes were exacted with precision, feeding the machinery of temples and palaces. The very efficiency of the system may have burdened those who lived under it. Was this a renaissance of prosperity, or also a regime of demands that strained the resilience of its people? The evidence is partial, yet the questions linger, carried in the silence between the lines of clay. Ur-Nammu's reign ended violently. Sources suggest he fell in battle, but his successors carried forward his vision. Shulgi, his son, ruled for nearly half a century, extending the empire's reach and deepening its cultural imprint. He claimed divine status, presenting himself as a god-king in his own lifetime. He standardized weights and measures, sponsored hymns and literature, and strengthened the network of scribal schools. Under his reign, the Ur-3 state reached its zenith. The archives swell with documents from his time, a reflection of both the empire's reach and its relentless need for administration. It was also during Shulgi's rule that Sumerian literature flourished anew. Hymns praising kings and gods, wisdom texts, and lamentations began to be copied and preserved, part of a cultural renaissance that sought to root the empire in ancestral traditions. In later centuries, scribes would look back to these texts as classics, preserving them long after Sumerian ceased to be spoken. The Neo-Sumerian age was thus not only a political experiment but a cultural rebirth, anchoring memory in both stone and word. But even the most carefully ordered systems are fragile. By the end of the Ur-3 dynasty, the empire began to unravel. External pressures mounted, most notably from the Amorites, tribal groups pressing in from the western deserts, and from Elamites to the east. Internal strains too became evident: revolts in the provinces, disruptions in the food supply, cracks in the administrative machine. Tablets from the later period speak of famine, unrest, and desperate measures. The same bureaucracy that once embodied order now reveals a state struggling to hold itself together. In 2004 BCE, the end came. Elamite forces captured Ur, carrying away its last king, Ibisin, into exile. The great ziggurats still stood upon the plain, but the empire that built it had fallen. Sumerian culture did not vanish. It continued to echo in the cities and traditions of Mesopotamia. But the dream of a unified Sumer under the rule of Ur was broken. The Amorites would rise in the centuries that followed, ushering in new dynasties and shifting the balance of Mesopotamian power. And yet, the memory of Ur-3 endured. Later kings, even those far removed in time, looked back to Ur-Nammu and Shulgi as models of justice, builders of temples, restorers of order. Archaeologists who uncovered the ziggurat at Ur, still rising from the desert floor after 4,000 years, saw not only brick and bitumen, but the persistence of vision, a statement in mud and stone that the Sumerians had once sought permanence against the shifting tides of history. Today, as we read the ration lists of anonymous workers and walk the steps of Ur's ziggurat, we feel both the intimacy and the distance of that world. The tablets remind us that empires are not only kings and conquests, but also the daily lives of those who baked bread, counted sheep, and carried bricks. The ruins remind us that every empire, however meticulous, must face the fragility of time. The Neo-Sumerian Renaissance at Ur-3 was brief, barely a century in the long sweep of history. Yet in that span, it gathered the threads of a civilization, wove them into new forms, and left a legacy that outlasted its fall. Its laws, its literature, its temples, and its archives remain, fragments of a vision both ordered and vulnerable. And so we are left with the image of Ur's great ziggurat, rising against the horizon, a staircase of brick climbing into the sky. It stands as both a monument and a question. What drove humanity, again and again, to build so high, to organize so fully, and to believe that permanence could be carved out of clay? The answers lie partly in the ruins, partly in ourselves, and partly in the silence where history recedes into myth. Chapter 11, The Code of Hammurabi and Babylonian Justice. In the heart of Mesopotamia, nearly 4,000 years ago, a Babylonian king sought to etch order into stone. Hammurabi, who reigned from 1792 to 1750 BCE, was no ordinary ruler. He inherited a modest city-state, but through strategy, alliances, and war, he forged an empire that stretched across much of Mesopotamia. Yet Hammurabi's most enduring legacy was not his conquests, but his words, carved in cuneiform on a towering basalt stele standing over 7 feet tall. This monument, now preserved in the Louvre Museum, is known as the Code of Hammurabi. Upon its dark surface are inscribed 282 laws, one of the earliest known attempts to codify justice for an entire kingdom. At the top of the stele, above the columns of text, is an image that sets the tone for everything below. Hammurabi stands before Shamash, the sun god and divine lord of justice, receiving a rod and a ring, symbols of kingship and law. This scene is not merely decorative, it proclaims that the laws which follow are not arbitrary human decrees, but divinely sanctioned. In this single image, Hammurabi is framed as the mediator between heaven and earth, entrusted with bringing divine order into human society. The code itself is sweeping in scope. It addresses theft, debt, marriage, inheritance, wages, and trade. It covers disputes over farmland, rules for irrigation, and penalties for negligence. Some laws feel surprisingly pragmatic and specific. For instance, if a farmer allowed his irrigation canal to overflow and flood a neighbor's field, he was required to make restitution for the lost crop. If a builder constructed a house that later collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's own son could be put to death. This last example reflects the principle most famously associated with Hammurabi, lex talionis, the law of retaliation, often summarized as an eye for an eye. But the code was not purely about punishment. Many of its provisions are designed to protect the vulnerable. Widows, orphans, debtors, and laborers. It sets maximum interest rates on loans, regulates the wages of herdsmen and field hands, and requires merchants to deal fairly with customers. This suggests that Hammurabi's project was not merely about controlling his subjects, but about creating a sense of stability in a kingdom made up of many different cities and peoples. Justice, in this vision, was not random. It was written, public, and theoretically available to all. The stele itself was placed in a public space, likely a temple or market square, where anyone could view it. Few could read cuneiform, but the very presence of the stone communicated a powerful message. The king had fixed the rules, and the gods had endorsed them. Justice was no longer a matter of personal revenge or tribal custom. It was a matter of state, overseen by the king's officials and administered according to written law. Yet scholars debate how these laws were actually applied. Some argue that the code was not a literal legal manual, but a symbolic statement of royal ideology. Court records from Babylon show that judges often decided cases based on precedent and local custom, rather than citing specific articles from the code. The stele may have functioned less as a practical handbook, and more as a monument proclaiming Hammurabi's role as a just ruler, a piece of political theatre cast in stone. This tension between fairness and control, between justice as an ideal and law as a tool of power, lingers over Hammurabi's code. The punishments are often harsh, especially for the lower classes. A nobleman who put out the eye of another nobleman would have his own eye put out, but if he blinded a commoner, he merely paid a fine. The code thus reflects a stratified society, one where equality before the law was limited by class and status. Still, there is something remarkable about the ambition of Hammurabi's project. He sought to make justice visible, to give it form, to place it in stone where all could see it. In doing so, he linked the legitimacy of his rule to the fairness of his laws. His prologue to the code is telling. Hammurabi describes himself as the shepherd of the people, tasked by the gods to cause justice to prevail, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong may not oppress the weak. The language of this prologue is almost poetic, reminding us that law in ancient Mesopotamia was never merely bureaucratic, it was cosmic. Just as the stars trace their ordained paths across the heavens, so too must human beings walk the straight path of justice. The law was a reflection of me, the divine decrees that governed all aspects of life. To violate the law was to break harmony with the universe itself. Even after Hammurabi's empire faded, his code continued to circulate. Copies were made for scribal schools, where future administrators and judges studied them. Fragments of the code have been found far from Babylon, in cities across Mesopotamia, testifying to its long influence. Later kings drew inspiration from Hammurabi's example, issuing their own collections of laws and boasting of their justice in inscriptions. And yet, the stele of Hammurabi itself carries an unsettling postscript. At its base is a curse directed against anyone who would deface or alter the text. Hammurabi calls upon the gods to destroy the name, seed, and memory of any future ruler who dares to erase his words. This final touch reminds us that the code was not just a neutral document of law. It was a monument to the king's own glory, meant to project his presence far beyond his lifetime. Today, as we stand before the stele in the Louvre, its black surface still gleaming after nearly 4 millennia, we sense something of the awe it must have inspired in Hammurabi's subjects. We can imagine a Babylonian citizen standing before it, tracing the carved lines with their eyes, aware that they were gazing upon the word of the king, and by extension, the word of the gods. But questions remain. Did this code truly bring justice, or did it sanctify a system of control? Was it meant to protect the weak, or to remind them of their place? And does the image of Hammurabi receiving the law from Shamash represent divine endorsement, or royal propaganda? The stele does not answer. It stands silently, a witness from a world where justice was measured in barley rations and blood price, where the promise of fairness was carved in stone even as life remained perilous and fragile. It invites us to wonder whether law can ever be more than a reflection of the power that creates it, and whether the dream of perfect justice is itself as enduring and as elusive as the black basalt stele of Hammurabi. Chapter 12. The Tower of Babel and Babylonian. Myth in the heart of ancient Babylon, rising from the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, there once stood a tower whose memory has never entirely faded. To the Babylonians, it was called Etemenanki, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. To later ages, it became the Tower of Babel, immortalized in scripture as the site where humanity's single language was shattered into many. Between history and myth, between archaeology and allegory, the tower still looms, a vanished monument whose shadow stretches across cultures and centuries. Etemenanki was no ordinary structure. Archaeologists describe it as a colossal ziggurat, a stepped pyramid of mud brick soaring hundreds of feet above the plain. Its base measured more than 90 meters on each side, and ancient records hint at a height that may have matched its breadth. Constructed and reconstructed over centuries, the tower dominated Babylon's sacred precinct, its summit crowned with a shrine dedicated to Marduk, the city's chief deity. For those who walked its precincts, the ziggurat was more than architecture. It was a cosmic axis, a symbolic mountain built by human hands, anchoring Earth to the heavens. The roots of this vision lay deep in Mesopotamian tradition. From the earliest cities of Sumer, ziggurats had served as sacred platforms, elevating temples above the dust and floodplains. Yet Etemenanki was grander still, the culmination of generations of building. In the 7th century BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar II undertook its most ambitious reconstruction. His inscriptions boast of raising the tower skyward, of restoring its form to awe both gods and men. To the Babylonians, such works testified not only to royal power, but to divine presence. The ziggurat was a link between realms, its stairways envisioned as pathways for gods descending to earth. But outside Babylon, the memory of the tower took on a different cast. In the Hebrew Bible, the Tower of Babel appears as a symbol of human pride and divine intervention. "Let us build a tower that reaches to the heavens," the people declared, seeking to make a name for themselves. But the tale turns from ambition to rupture. God confuses their speech, scattering them across the earth, each with a different tongue. What for the Babylonians was a center of unity and devotion became, in biblical retelling, a cautionary tale of hubris and dispersion. The link between the biblical account and the historical Etemenanki is debated but compelling. Jewish exiles in Babylon during the 6th century BCE would have walked beneath the shadow of the tower, their memories mingling with myth. To them, the soaring ziggurat may have seemed both wondrous and oppressive, a monument to the empire that held them captive. Out of this experience, the legend may have grown, an inversion of Babylon's claim to divine order, casting its tower as the scene of divine judgment. Archaeology, too, plays its part in unraveling the story. Excavations in the early 20th century revealed the foundations of Etemenanki, massive mud brick platforms confirming the ziggurat's vast scale. Fragments of cuneiform texts, such as the es-Sawwan tablet, describe its dimensions and design, offering rare glimpses of its form. The tablet notes a 7-tiered structure, each stage adorned with symbolic colours, rising until the shrine at its summit touched the sky. Later depictions, such as a clay cylinder inscribed under Nebuchadnezzar, further attest to the tower's restoration and ritual significance. Yet no definitive reconstruction exists. The tower was rebuilt many times, and its ultimate fate, whether toppled by conquest, erosion, or deliberate dismantling, remains uncertain. What we do know is that the memory of Etemenanki endured long after its bricks had crumbled. Greek travelers, in the centuries after Babylon's fall, still described the ruins of a mighty tower. Herodotus spoke of a stepped structure with a temple at its summit, though scholars debate whether he saw it firsthand or relied on second-hand accounts. Later, in Hellenistic and Roman writings, the tower was remembered as a marvel of the East, a symbol of Babylon's splendor and mystery. Yet the myths of Babel outlast even these records. The story of confused tongues has resonated across cultures as an explanation for humanity's diversity of speech. It suggests that language itself, the very medium by which humans connect, is both a gift and a barrier, a bridge and a division. In this way, the Tower of Babel is not only a story about architecture, but about the limits of human unity. Can ambition forge a single people? Or will difference always emerge, scattering us like dust in the wind? Some scholars read the tale not only as a critique of pride, but as a meditation on empire. The Ziggurat of Babylon was a monument of centralization, a visible assertion that the world's axis ran through one city, one king, one god. To those beyond its walls, such concentration of power may have seemed threatening. The biblical narrative, then, might be seen as a subversion. The tower, as symbol of empire undone, its unity fractured by divine will. And yet, the deeper mystery lingers. Was the tower truly seen as a stairway to the heavens, a physical attempt to breach the divine? Or was it understood, even in its own time, as metaphor, a ritual axis, a statement of cosmic order? The line between myth and monument is blurred, and perhaps it was always meant to be. For the Babylonians, building in brick was never just practical. Each layer of mud and bitumen was a prayer, an offering, a reenactment of creation itself. Today, the site of Etemenanki lies quiet. The great ziggurat is gone, its bricks long dismantled, its terraces reduced to rubble. Yet its story persists, in texts, in legends, in the imagination of every culture that inherited its echoes. Artists through the centuries have painted visions of the tower spiraling into the clouds, a monument half finished, crumbling even as it rises. Scholars still pore over fragments, seeking its true dimensions. Pilgrims of the mind still wander its stairways in dream. The Tower of Babel, then, is less a ruin than a symbol. It stands at the crossroads of memory and myth, where archaeology meets theology, and where the human longing for unity meets the inevitability of division. Its absence is as powerful as its presence once was. The temple that sought to bind heaven and earth now exists only in fragments of clay, in the cadence of scripture, in the enduring riddle of language itself. And so, as we close our eyes upon Babylon's vanished skyline, we are left with questions rather than answers. Did Etemenanki truly pierce the clouds? Did humanity once speak with a single voice? Or is the tower's story a mirror, reflecting our timeless desire to climb higher, to reach the divine, and to understand one another in a world that always speaks in many tongues? Chapter 13. The Kassites and a Forgotten Dynasty. When the glory of Hammurabi's Babylon faded, the city fell under the shadow of foreign rule. Around 1595 BCE, the Hittites swept down from Anatolia, sacked Babylon, and then withdrew. leaving a power vacuum in the heart of Mesopotamia. Into this void came the Kassites, a mountain people from the Zagros range, whose origins remain obscure and whose language still resists full decipherment. For more than 4 centuries, longer than nearly any other Mesopotamian dynasty, the Kassites ruled Babylon, quietly stabilizing a region that had been racked by war and political collapse. And yet, for all their longevity, they are among the most mysterious of Mesopotamian dynasties. The Kassites left behind few grand monuments. Their art, compared to the exuberant reliefs of the Assyrians or the monumental ziggurats of the Sumerians, is modest and restrained. Their inscriptions are rare, and their language, unrelated to Sumerian or Akkadian, has yielded only fragments to modern scholars. And yet, what little evidence survives suggests that they were skilled administrators and capable rulers. They restored Babylon's temples, revived its economy, and presided over centuries of relative peace. An achievement remarkable for a region so often torn by rival city-states and empires. One of the most distinctive legacies of the Kassite dynasty is the kuduru, or boundary stone. These carved stones functioned as legal documents, recording royal land grants and privileges. On their surfaces, cuneiform inscriptions detail the names of the beneficiaries, the size and location of the property, and the conditions under which it was granted. Surrounding the text are carved symbols of the gods: a crescent for Sin, the moon god; a starburst for Shamash, the sun god; a horned cap for Enlil. These divine emblems served as cosmic witnesses, guaranteeing the validity of the grant and threatening curses upon anyone who would alter or violate it. The kuduru stones are strikingly visual, filled with a language of symbols that conveys divine presence even to those who could not read. They remind us that for the Kassites, law and religion were deeply intertwined. The grant of land was not merely a royal favor, it was a sacred act, overseen by the pantheon itself. To defy the terms of the kuduru was not only a crime against the state, it was a sacrilege. The Kassites were also instrumental in the spread of horse culture in Mesopotamia. While horses had been present in the Near East earlier, the Kassites are often credited with refining their use in warfare and ceremonial display. Some of the earliest known texts on horse training, including detailed manuals describing feeding, grooming, and conditioning, come from Kassite period archives. These documents reveal a highly systematic approach to horsemanship, suggesting that the Kassite court valued horses not only as tools of war, but as symbols of prestige and divine favor. Diplomacy under the Kassites reached far beyond Mesopotamia. Babylon became a participant in what modern historians call the Great Powers Club of the Late Bronze Age, a network of kingdoms that included Egypt, Hatti, Mitanni, and later Assyria. Clay tablets from Amarna in Egypt preserve letters exchanged between Kassite kings and pharaohs of the 14th century BCE. These letters discuss the exchange of gifts, horses, lapis lazuli, gold, and the negotiation of royal marriages. The tone is one of equality. The Kassite king addresses the pharaoh as brother, signaling that Babylon had regained a place among the great diplomatic powers of the age. Yet, despite this international presence, the Kassite dynasty left few traces of its inner life. Their royal inscriptions are terse, their temples unadorned compared to earlier or later periods. Perhaps they ruled with a light touch, seeking to integrate rather than dominate their Babylonian subjects. Perhaps their monuments simply lie undiscovered, waiting beneath layers of soil and time. Whatever the reason, the Kassites remain enigmatic. A dynasty we know lasted for centuries, yet whose kings are often little more than names on king lists. Archaeologists have recovered administrative tablets from Kassite Babylon that testify to a sophisticated bureaucracy. Grain rations, temple offerings, labor allocations, all are carefully recorded. These texts reveal a society that was stable enough to sustain large-scale agriculture and temple life, suggesting that the Kassites succeeded in maintaining the delicate balance between city, field, and canal that had always been the lifeblood of Mesopotamian civilization. Even their downfall was quiet compared to the dramatic ends of other empires. By the 12th century BCE, pressure from the Elamites and Aramean incursions weakened the dynasty. The Kassites eventually disappeared from the historical record, their language vanishing with them. Babylon would rise again under new rulers, but the memory of the Kassite kings faded into near silence. Today, The Kuduru stones stand as the most tangible legacy of this forgotten dynasty. Their carved divine symbols, the serpent, the lightning fork, the spade of Marduk, still seem to radiate power, as though the gods are watching across the centuries. They are reminders that even a dynasty with little fanfare can leave a mark upon the land that endures. And yet, the Kassites remain a riddle. Who were they before they descended into Mesopotamia? What tongue did they speak among themselves? And what stories did they tell of their gods and ancestors? Were they conquerors who imposed their will, or shepherds of a land they sought to heal after centuries of war? The tablets do not answer, and the stones are silent. We are left with fragments, a handful of names, a scattering of treaties, the quiet endurance of Babylonian culture under their watch. The Kassites remind us that history is not only written by the victors, but shaped by those who held the center, who kept the fields watered and the temples supplied, even when the world outside was in turmoil. Somewhere in the Zagros Mountains, the cradle of their people, there may still lie the traces of Kassite strongholds, waiting to tell the rest of the story. Until then, their dynasty remains a half-lit chapter in the long chronicle of Mesopotamia, a reminder that even 4 centuries of rule can slip into near invisibility when time chooses to be silent. Chapter 14. The Assyrian War Machine. In the rugged landscapes of northern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris River carves its path through fertile plains and stony ridges, a kingdom once rose whose very name became a synonym for terror and dominion. This was Assyria, an empire forged not only by kings and cities, but by the relentless march of its armies. To their neighbors, the Assyrians were both feared and admired, masters of organized violence, wielders of iron, engineers of siegecraft, and visionaries of conquest on a scale never before attempted in the ancient Near East. To walk among the carved reliefs of Nineveh or Nimrud is to see their war machine immortalized in stone. Endless lines of soldiers, thundering chariots, and towering siege engines pressing inexorably against the walls of their enemies. The story of the Assyrian army begins not with sudden conquest, but with centuries of refinement. Early Assyria was a modest kingdom, its heartland clustered around the city of Ashur. But geography gave it a strategic advantage. The northern plains allowed for horses and herds, while the Tigris offered access to trade and movement. From this foundation, Assyrian kings began to experiment with militarization, shaping a state in which warfare was not an occasional necessity, but a permanent institution. Every subject owed service, every resource could be mobilized, and every campaign fed into the next. By the 9th century BCE, under kings like Ashurnasirpal II, Assyria had transformed war into a science. Reliefs from his palace at Kalhu depict campaigns of extraordinary brutality and precision. Soldiers march in ordered ranks, archers advance under the cover of shields, and great chariots, once symbols of aristocratic prestige, now serve as lethal platforms for coordinated assault. We see towns besieged with ladders, walls broken by battering rams, rivers forded in disciplined formation. We also see the aftermath: prisoners led away, cities burned, captives impaled upon stakes. These images were not only records but propaganda, carved to impress upon viewers the inevitability of Assyrian victory and the futility of resistance. What set the Assyrian war machine apart was not merely its weapons, but its integration. Infantry, cavalry, and chariotry worked in unison, supported by sappers and engineers. Siegecraft reached new heights. Assyrian armies dragged massive rams to city gates, shielded by wooden towers, while archers unleashed volleys from behind protective screens. Excavations at Lachish, in Judah, reveal reliefs from the reign of Sennacherib, showing ramps of earth piled against walls, towers wheeled into place, and defenders showered with arrows and stones. It is among the most vivid depictions of ancient warfare, a frozen moment where technology, manpower, and fear converged. Iron played its part as well. While bronze had dominated earlier ages, the Assyrians embraced ironworking on a scale that allowed them to equip vast armies. Iron-tipped arrows, iron swords, and iron fittings for chariots gave their soldiers an advantage in both durability and supply. Though not invincible, their armies could field numbers and equipment unmatched by their rivals. To many contemporaries, the Assyrians seemed inexhaustible, an empire of soldiers bred for conquest. Yet the war machine, was also a political instrument. Kings like Tiglath-Pileser III reorganized the empire into provinces directly overseen by royal officials, ensuring that conquered lands fed the Assyrian military engine. Deportations became a calculated strategy. Entire populations were uprooted and resettled across the empire, their labor redirected, their resistance broken by dispersion. These mass movements, recorded in both Assyrian inscriptions and biblical accounts, served dual purposes, suppressing rebellion while enriching the empire with skilled workers from distant lands. The psychological dimension of Assyrian warfare cannot be overlooked. Their inscriptions speak with chilling frankness. Cities destroyed, devastated and burned, enemies flayed alive, heads stacked in heaps. To modern readers, these boastful cruelties are shocking, but in their time, they were part of a deliberate performance. Terror itself was a weapon, designed to precede the army, to break morale before the first arrow was loosed. Resistance, the kings proclaimed, would bring annihilation, submission, protection. And yet, alongside this cruelty, there was also sophistication. Assyrian kings were patrons of art and architecture, their capitals adorned with vast palaces whose walls bore the very scenes of conquest. In Nineveh, Sennacherib constructed gardens irrigated by aqueducts, a feat of engineering that mirrored the precision of his armies. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian monarch, assembled a library of texts from across Mesopotamia, preserving myths, medical treatises, and omen literature. Even as the armies marched, scribes wrote, artists carved, and engineers built. The war machine fed not only destruction, but an empire-wide system of knowledge and control. Still, the relentlessness of Assyria contained the seeds of fragility. Constant campaigns required constant resources. Subject peoples burdened by tribute and deportation harbored resentment. Provinces rebelled whenever the central power weakened, and maintaining the vast machinery of empire strained even the most capable kings. In the late 7th century BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes turned the tactics of siege against Assyria itself. The once terrifying war machine collapsed with startling speed. By 612 BCE, Nineveh lay in ruins, its palaces burned, its reliefs shattered, its armies scattered. The empire of iron and terror was no more, yet the memory of Assyria endured. Greek historians recounted its power, the Bible remembered its cruelty, and archaeologists in the 19th century uncovered its palaces, revealing scenes of war carved with breathtaking detail. In these images, we glimpse both the genius and the brutality of a people who pushed the boundaries of organized warfare. Their legacy lies not only in conquest, but in the very concept of empire, territorial control enforced by relentless military strength, sustained by infrastructure and ideology. The Assyrian war machine was more than weapons and soldiers. It was a vision of the world, one in which order was imposed through discipline, terror, and strategy. Its echoes can be felt in every empire that followed, each grappling with the same paradox, that power built on fear may expand swiftly, but it cannot endure forever. And so, we are left with the carved reliefs, silent yet eloquent, their lines still sharp after nearly 3 millennia. Soldiers march eternally in stone, chariots charge forever across imagined plains, and kings stand triumphant over vanquished foes. But behind their triumphs, we sense the cost, the weight of empire, the burden of conquest, and the inevitability that even the mightiest war machine must one day fall silent. Chapter 15. The Library of Ashurbanipal. The dust and ruin of ancient Nineveh, archaeologists unearthed a treasure unlike any other. A library, not of scrolls or bound volumes, but of clay. 30,000 tablets, each pressed with the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform, once filled the shelves of the royal palace of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria. Together, they form the oldest known royal library in the world, a window into the intellectual, spiritual, and administrative heart of Mesopotamia. To understand the weight of this discovery, we must step into the reign of Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 669 to roughly 631 BCE. The Assyrian Empire was at its height, stretching from the mountains of Anatolia to the marshes of Elam, from the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf. Its armies were feared, its cities fortified, its art filled with scenes of kings hunting lions and trampling enemies. Yet Ashurbanipal was more than a warrior king. He was a scholar, an avid collector of knowledge, and he saw in the written word a power as potent as the spear. The tablets that once lined his library cover nearly every aspect of life. There are letters, legal contracts, administrative lists. There are omen texts, carefully cataloguing the movements of planets, the shapes of livers in animal sacrifice, the births of malformed animals, each interpreted as messages from the gods. There are medical texts describing treatments for illness, charms to ward off demons, and recipes for healing mixtures of herbs and resins. There are hymns, laments, and royal inscriptions. And there are epics, the great myths of Mesopotamia, copied and recopied by scribes who understood that these stories were the lifeblood of a civilization. Among the most famous of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved here more completely than anywhere else. The tale of the king of Uruk and his search for immortality, his friendship with Enkidu, his journey to the edge of the world, is one of the oldest and most profound reflections on the human condition ever written. Without Ashurbanipal's library, much of this story, and much of Mesopotamian myth itself, might have been lost forever. But Ashurbanipal's project was not simply an act of cultural preservation, it was also an assertion of power. The king sent letters across his empire, instructing priests and scholars to send him copies of every significant text. Where copies did not exist, he ordered that originals be seized and brought to Nineveh. Knowledge, like tribute, was to be gathered in the capital. His library was a statement that all wisdom, all divine insight, would flow to the throne of Assyria. The tablets themselves speak with a certain intimacy. Some are neat and carefully inscribed, clearly made for permanent storage. Others are hurried, filled with corrections and smudges, working documents from the scribal schools and temple archives. A few bear curses against anyone who might remove or damage them, calling upon the gods to erase the offender's name from memory. These tablets were not meant to wander. They were meant to endure, to remain in Nineveh as a perpetual reservoir of sacred and practical knowledge. Yet even the might of Assyria could not guarantee permanence. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes besieged Nineveh. The city fell after 3 months of brutal fighting. The palace burned, and with it, the shelves of the library. The heat of the fire baked many of the tablets, hardening them so that they survived the destruction. Others shattered into fragments, to be painstakingly pieced together by modern scholars like a vast, scattered puzzle. When Henry Layard and Austin Henry Layard's team first excavated the ruins in the mid-19th century, they must have been astonished by the sheer scale of what they had found. Room after room littered with tablets. They were shipped to the British Museum by the thousands, where they remain to this day, still being read, translated, and catalogued. Each tablet is a whisper from 3,000 years ago, carrying forward the voices of scribes, priests, and kings. The intellectual world revealed in these texts is surprisingly sophisticated. The Mesopotamians observed the heavens with relentless care, compiling star catalogues and lunar tables that sought to detect patterns in celestial events. They developed systematic approaches to medicine, balancing incantations with empirical remedies. They preserved ancient Sumerian hymns even as they composed new ones in Akkadian. The library shows a civilization deeply concerned with order, cosmic, social, and spiritual, and with understanding its place in a universe ruled by capricious gods. But there is also a sense of foreboding that threads through many of these works. The omen texts, with their detailed predictions of calamity, reflect a worldview in which disaster was always just beyond the horizon. The laments speak of cities destroyed, temples abandoned, gods who turned their faces away. Reading them today, one cannot help but feel that they anticipated the fate of Nineveh itself, that the library, in its vastness, became a kind of tomb for a civilization that knew its own power was fragile. The story of Ashurbanipal's library is therefore not just one of preservation, but of loss. What we have are fragments, stitched together by scholarship. Many tablets remain broken, their words incomplete, their meaning only partially understood. Others are missing entirely, leaving gaps in the chain of thought that once bound together the ancient world's greatest storehouse of knowledge. And yet, even in its partial state, the library stands as one of the most extraordinary achievements of the ancient world. It reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is as old as kingship itself, that writing was not merely for trade or administration, but for reaching toward the eternal. When we read these texts today, we are reading across a gulf of millennia, hearing the same questions that haunted Ashurbanipal's scribes. How do we appease the gods? What is the meaning of suffering? Can a man achieve lasting fame, or must he be forgotten like the dust of Nineveh? The ruins of the palace are silent now, but the tablets still speak. They carry with them the last great breath of Assyrian civilization before the fires closed over it. They are the memory of a world that refused to be forgotten. And yet, how much more was lost, burned, shattered, scattered into the earth, waiting still for rediscovery? Chapter 16. The Fall of Nineveh and the End of Assyria. In the summer of 612 BCE, the unthinkable came to pass. Nineveh, jewel of the Assyrian Empire, city of vast palaces and towering walls, fell to fire and sword. For centuries, the Assyrians had stood as masters of the Near East. Their armies feared from the mountains of Anatolia to the marshes of the Persian Gulf. Yet in a single season, the empire that seemed unassailable crumbled. What remains today are charred ruins, toppled statues, and the haunting question: how does such a power collapse so swiftly? To understand the fall of Nineveh, we must first recall the empire it embodied. At its height, Assyria ruled through precision and terror. Its kings, Ashurnasirpal, Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal, built not only armies but entire systems of administration, tribute, and deportation. Their palaces were carved with endless victories. Their inscriptions boasted of enemies annihilated. Yet beneath this facade of invincibility lay fragility. Continuous warfare drained resources. Tribute weighed heavily on subject peoples. Deportations sowed unrest even as they enriched the empire. Like the ziggurats that rose upon fragile mud brick, Assyria's grandeur stood upon foundations, more brittle than they appeared. The immediate catalyst came with the death of Ashurbanipal in 627 BCE. His reign had been one of cultural splendor, his great library in Nineveh preserving texts of Sumer and Babylon, but also of relentless campaigning. With his passing, the empire fractured. Civil wars erupted between rival claimants to the throne. Provinces long suppressed seized the opportunity to rebel. For the first time in generations, Assyria's enemies sensed weakness. From the east came the Medes, a rising power from the Iranian plateau. From the south and west came the Babylonians, eager to throw off Assyrian rule and reclaim independence. Old rivalries dissolved in the face of shared opportunity. By 615 BCE, the Medes had taken Ashur, the ancient religious heart of Assyria. By 614, they pressed deeper into Assyrian lands. 2 years later, they joined forces with Nabopolassar of Babylon, sealing the fate of Nineveh. The siege itself is described in later chronicles and confirmed by archaeology. Nineveh was no ordinary city. Its walls stretched 12 kilometers, reinforced with towers and gates. Within, palaces gleamed with alabaster reliefs. Canals and aqueducts carried water, and gardens flourished. Yet no wall is eternal. The coalition armies encircled the city, battering its defenses, cutting supply lines. According to tradition, the Tigris itself aided the attackers, flooding part of the walls and weakening their foundations. Whether by flood, fire, or sheer force, the gates fell. What followed was destruction on a scale remembered for centuries. Babylonian records speak of plunder, of palaces burned, of inhabitants slaughtered. Archaeological layers at Nineveh reveal charred beams, collapsed vaults, smashed statues, evidence of deliberate devastation. The great library of Ashurbanipal, though preserved in part by the fire that baked its clay tablets, was buried beneath rubble. The colossal winged bulls that once guarded palace entrances lie fractured, their faces mutilated. Nineveh did not simply fall, it was annihilated, erased as a warning to all who might seek to revive its power. And yet, the speed of Assyria's collapse remains striking. Within just 3 years, from Ashurbanipal's death to Nineveh's destruction, an empire that had dominated for centuries vanished. The reasons are many. Endless campaigns had exhausted both treasury and population. Harsh policies of terror created enemies eager for vengeance. Succession struggles divided leadership at the worst possible moment. The Assyrians had mastered the art of conquest, but not of durability. Their empire, vast and fearsome, had burned too hot to last. For their conquerors, the ruins of Nineveh were both triumph and omen. The Babylonians soon rose to dominance, establishing the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. The Medes expanded across the Iranian plateau. But even they recognized the magnitude of what had ended. The prophet Nahum, writing from Judah, called Nineveh the bloody city, full of lies and plunder. To him and others, its fall was not merely political but cosmic, a sign that arrogance and cruelty, no matter how mighty, invite destruction. Today, The ruins of Nineveh stand near modern Mosul in Iraq. Excavations since the 19th century have revealed its splendor. The sprawling palace of Sennacherib, the lion hunt reliefs of Ashurbanipal, the remnants of its massive gates. Yet alongside these triumphs of art and engineering lie the blackened strata of fire, the mute testimony of a city consumed. Visitors walk among toppled stones, the silence broken only by wind across the plain. The end of Assyria did not erase its influence. Its military innovations, administrative systems, and cultural achievements echoed in the empires that followed: Babylonian, Persian, even Roman. Its memory survived in scripture and myth, a cautionary tale of cruelty undone. But its cities, Ashur, Nimrud, Nineveh, became ghosts, their names whispered through centuries of ruin. And so we return to the haunting question. Why did such a mighty power fall so quickly? Was it the flood that breached Nineveh's walls? Or the flood of resentment that centuries of conquest had sown? Was it the weight of empire itself, collapsing under its own demands? The answers lie partly in clay tablets, partly in charred beams, and partly in the silence that follows fire. The fall of Nineveh reminds us that even the greatest powers stand upon fragile ground. Empires rise like towers, built brick by brick upon human effort and ambition. And yet, with a single season's storm, they may collapse, leaving only ruins, myths, and the uneasy echo of their passing. Chapter 17, Nebuchadnezzar II and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The story of Nebuchadnezzar II begins in the shadow of Assyria's fall. The Assyrian Empire, once unstoppable, had crumbled under the combined weight of Median and Babylonian forces. From the ruins of Nineveh, a new power rose on the floodplains of the Euphrates, determined not merely to inherit the Assyrian mantle, but to eclipse it. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, under Nebuchadnezzar's rule from 605 to 562 BCE, became one of the most dazzling civilizations the ancient world had ever seen, and one of its most feared. When Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne, Babylon was already ancient. Its ziggurats and temples had been standing in some form for 2,000 years. But under his reign, the city was transformed. Archaeologists who have walked its ruins speak of a place designed to impress and to overwhelm. The processional way, paved with massive slabs of limestone, stretched for hundreds of meters, leading visitors directly toward the city's sacred heart. Along its path, lions in molded relief stride eternally across glazed blue bricks, guardians of Ishtar, goddess of love and war. At the end of the processional way rose the Ishtar Gate, one of the true marvels of antiquity. Its bricks, baked and painted in brilliant lapis blue, gleamed in the Mesopotamian sun. Rows of striding bulls and serpent dragons called mushushu seemed to emerge from the surface, their forms both protective and menacing. Through this gate, priests and kings passed during festivals, carrying statues of the gods along the avenue in a ritual that symbolically renewed cosmic order. Even now, reconstructed in Berlin's Pergamon Museum, the Ishtar Gate radiates an almost otherworldly presence, as if it remembers the chants and processions that once echoed between its walls. Beyond the gate, Babylon's sacred precincts rose. Chief among them was Etemenanki, the great ziggurat dedicated to Marduk, the city's patron deity. Its name meant House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, a structure that may have inspired later legends of the Tower of Babel. This stepped pyramid, soaring perhaps 90 meters high, was crowned by a temple where priests observed the heavens, tracking the motions of stars and planets with astonishing precision. These were not idle stargazers. The Babylonian scholars who worked here compiled astronomical diaries stretching across generations, recording eclipses, conjunctions, and portents. Their data formed the foundations of what we now call astronomy. Nebuchadnezzar's reign was not only about spectacle and scholarship, it was also an age of conquest. His armies ranged across the Near East, subduing rebellious cities and securing Babylonian dominance. One of the most consequential campaigns was against the Kingdom of Judah. In 597 BCE, and again a decade later, Jerusalem was besieged. Its walls were breached, its temple plundered, and many of its inhabitants were carried into exile. The event remembered in the Hebrew Bible as the Babylonian captivity. For the Judeans, Babylon became both a place of suffering and of transformation, where their identity was refined under foreign rule. and their scriptures began to take their enduring shape. The exile also infused Babylon with a dual image in later tradition. At once the city of grandeur and the city of sin, a place of marvels and of mourning. The Psalms speak of exiles weeping by the rivers of Babylon, refusing to sing the songs of Zion in a strange land. In this way, Nebuchadnezzar's empire entered the moral imagination of the ancient world, a symbol of power that both dazzled and oppressed. Even the myths of Babylon seem to echo this tension. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk defeats the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat and fashions the world from her remains, establishing Babylon as the center of cosmic order. To its inhabitants, the city was the navel of the universe, the axis through which heaven and earth were joined. To outsiders, however, it could appear as a hubris-filled metropolis, defiant toward the gods, destined for downfall. This dual image of Babylon as holy city and Babylon as harlot would echo for centuries, shaping how later cultures, including the Greeks and Romans, imagined the East archaeologists who excavated Babylon in the 19th and early 20th centuries were astonished at the scale of Nebuchadnezzar's works. Vast double walls enclosed the city, some thick enough to drive chariots upon. Palaces with courtyards and throne rooms sprawled across the landscape. The so-called Southern Palace, with its many chambers, is thought to have been Nebuchadnezzar's main residence. There is even tantalizing evidence that somewhere within Babylon's precincts may have stood the legendary Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, though scholars still debate whether they were located here, or perhaps in Nineveh. If the gardens did exist in Babylon, they would have been an engineering marvel. Ancient accounts describe terraces lush with exotic plants, watered by ingenious irrigation systems that lifted water high above the ground. Some suggest they were built by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median queen, who longed for the mountains of her homeland. Whether this romantic story is true or not, it speaks to the image of Nebuchadnezzar as a king who could reshape nature itself, turning desert into paradise. But even paradise cannot last forever. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, his successors struggled to maintain the empire's power. Within a few decades, Babylon fell to Cyrus the Great of Persia in 539 BCE. The city was spared destruction, but its independence was gone and its days of glory slowly waned. Yet the memory of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon endured, preserved in texts, in ruins, and in the imaginations of those who came after. Today, the ruins of Babylon lie near the modern city of Hilla in Iraq. Visitors walk along the ancient processional way, through partially reconstructed gates, and past the remnants of temples and palaces. The site is still vast, still awe-inspiring, though much of its former splendor lies only in the mind's eye. To stand there at dusk with the wind moving across the desert plain is to feel the faint echo of an empire that once called itself the center of the world. And perhaps this is the truest legacy of Nebuchadnezzar too, that he built not just a city of stone and brick, but a city of myth, one that continues to rise in the imagination long after its towers have fallen. Babylon remains a name that stirs both wonder and unease, a reminder that human achievement and human ambition are forever intertwined. The processional way may be silent now, but its lions still stride in unending procession, their gaze fixed on a horizon we can no longer see. What other secrets lie buried beneath the sands, waiting to tell the rest of Babylon's story? What voices still whisper beneath the foundations of the city Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt, waiting for the day when they will be heard again? Chapter 18, The Hanging Gardens, Myth or Reality. Among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, 6 can be described with some degree of certainty. We know of the Great Pyramid of Giza, still standing against the desert sands. We hear of the statue of Zeus, the Temple of Artemis, the lighthouse at Alexandria, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, and the Colossus of Rhodes. But the 7th, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, remains cloaked in mist. Unlike the others, its very existence is uncertain. No Babylonian inscription, no surviving tablet, no definitive trace in the soil of Mesopotamia confirms it. And yet, through the writings of Greek historians and travelers, the vision of a lush terraced paradise has haunted imaginations for more than 2 millennia. The story is often told this way. In the 6th century BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar II, ruler of Babylon and master of a sprawling empire, built the gardens for his queen. She was said to have come from the green, mountainous lands of Media, and she longed for the cool forests and rising hills of her homeland. To soothe her homesickness, Nebuchadnezzar commanded a mountain to be raised in the flat plains of Babylon. Upon it grew trees, flowers, and vines that cascaded downward, giving the appearance of a living, hanging Eden. Greek authors such as Strabo and Philo of Byzantium described a remarkable feat of engineering. Vaulted terraces rose high into the air, supported by stone columns and waterproofed with layers of bitumen and lead. Archimedean screws, or some earlier method of hydraulic technology, lifted water from the Euphrates to feed the roots of imported trees. Shade cooled the air. Birds nested among branches. Visitors walked through a man-made mountain, hearing the murmur of water, breathing the fragrance of distant lands. To the Greek mind, such a place seemed both marvelous and improbable, a fusion of architecture and nature so daring it was counted among the world's great wonders. And yet, when we turn from the Greek accounts to Babylonian records, silence reigns. Nebuchadnezzar left behind thousands of inscriptions boasting of his conquests, his temples, his walls, his gates. He described his rebuilding of Babylon in rich detail. The Ishtar Gate with its radiant blue glaze, the processional way paved in limestone, the towering temples of Marduk. But nowhere does he mention a garden of terraces, no matter how wondrous. For a king who inscribed his accomplishments at every opportunity, the absence is striking. Archaeology deepens the puzzle. Excavations at Babylon, beginning in the 19th century under Robert Calderway, revealed monumental structures. The remnants of Nebuchadnezzar's palaces, his temples, and the thick fortification walls. Calderway even identified a series of arched vaults near the palace that he proposed might have supported the gardens. He imagined a vast terraced structure, watered by an ingenious system of pumps. For a time, his theory dominated scholarship, but later researchers questioned it. The vaults he identified may have been nothing more than storerooms. No irrigation channels, no botanical remains, no direct evidence of a hanging garden were ever found. This absence has led some scholars to ask, were the gardens truly in Babylon at all? Another theory points northward, to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, who ruled a century before Nebuchadnezzar, boasted in inscriptions of an extraordinary garden he built beside his palace. He described planting foreign trees, creating artificial hills, and devising an advanced aqueduct system to carry water across great distances. Archaeologists have confirmed that the Assyrians constructed vast canals and aqueducts, carved into cliffs, carrying water toward Nineveh. In one relief, Sennacherib even depicted terraced gardens with trees rising in ordered rows. To some, this seems more like the hanging gardens described by the Greeks than anything in Babylon itself. Perhaps later Greek writers, encountering fragmented stories of Assyrian marvels, mistakenly placed them in Babylon, the city they already regarded as the center of Mesopotamian grandeur. If the gardens truly belonged to Sennacherib, they would still deserve their place among the wonders. Imagine terraces rising above the Assyrian palace, watered by the waters of the Tigris, built not to comfort a queen, but to proclaim the power of a king who claimed dominion over mountains and rivers alike. The relocation of the wonder from Babylon to Nineveh remains debated, but it highlights a deeper truth. Memory in the ancient world often blurred across centuries, binding together the deeds of rival empires into a single legendary tapestry. Still, the allure of the Babylonian gardens endures. Perhaps it is because Babylon itself became a symbol of magnificence and downfall, remembered in both historical chronicles and sacred scripture. To place the gardens, there was to complete the vision of a city that was not merely powerful, but paradisiacal. Babylon was imagined as a place where walls rose like mountains, where temples touched the heavens, where rulers commanded not only armies, but nature itself. The gardens, whether real or myth, expressed that ideal perfectly. Some modern scholars suggest that the legend may have grown from smaller, more ordinary palace gardens. In Mesopotamia, royal courts often maintained green spaces irrigated from nearby rivers. Palm groves, orchards, and temple gardens appear in records throughout the region. In a land defined by arid plains and searing sun, the sight of cultivated greenery could feel miraculous. Could it be that travelers exaggerated these sights into tales of a mountain of terraces, each one dripping with shade and fragrance? The mystery remains unresolved. Archaeologists continue to search the soil of Babylon and Nineveh for traces of hydraulic systems, terraced foundations and imported plant remains. The clay tablets remain silent. The ruins yield only partial hints, yet the legend persists, not because it is confirmed, but because it invites us to imagine. A wonder that may never have existed still compels us to ask how humans, in the deep past, sought to bend nature into harmony with stone. In the end, the Hanging Gardens stand less as a proven monument and more as an idea of paradise created by human hands, of memory that lingers even without material proof. Whether Nebuchadnezzar's tribute to a homesick queen, or Sennacherib's demonstration of imperial might, or simply a myth woven by storytellers, the gardens remind us of the blurred line between history and legend. And so, we are left with a haunting question. Is it possible that one of the world's most famous wonders never existed at all? Or does it still lie buried beneath the soil of Mesopotamia, waiting for discovery? The answer remains just out of reach, suspended between memory and ruin, like branches heavy with fruit swaying in a wind that has long since passed. Chapter 19. Babylonian Astronomy and Mathematics. In the stillness of the Mesopotamian night, long before the rise of telescopes, the priests of Babylon stood on ziggurat terraces and watched the sky. They watched patiently, night after night, for decades and generations, tracking the movements of planets, the rise of constellations, the sudden disappearance of the moon in eclipse. These were not idle gazers, but scribes of the heavens, recording every anomaly on clay tablets that would outlast even the empires that paid them. What we call Babylonian astronomy was, at its heart, a marriage of devotion and precision. The heavens were believed to be the realm of the gods, and the motions of celestial bodies were not random, but signs, messages from divine beings that could foretell the fate of kings and cities. Yet this worldview did not hinder careful observation. If anything, it compelled it. Each strange star, each shadow cast across the moon, each bright wandering planet had to be measured, catalogued, and interpreted. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of such tablets from the ruins of Babylon, Uruk, and Sippar. Some are simple records of star risings and settings. Others contain detailed lunar and planetary tables spanning centuries. They show that Babylonian scholars could predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy, using repeating cycles known as the Saros, a period of roughly 18 years after which lunar and solar eclipses recur. This discovery did not require telescopes, only relentless observation and a deep memory preserved through writing. Their work transformed the sky into a kind of cosmic calendar. It was in Mesopotamia that the zodiac as we know it first emerged. The Babylonians divided the ecliptic, the path the sun appears to travel over the course of a year, into 12 equal sections, each named after a constellation: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and so forth. This division was practical, allowing astronomers to specify celestial positions with greater clarity. But it also gave rise to a new kind of astrology, one that moved beyond omens tied to a single night's observation to a system that mapped destiny onto the very framework of the heavens. This interplay of omen reading and mathematical rigor is one of Babylon's most intriguing legacies. A single tablet might record a planetary position with exact numbers, then proceed to interpret its meaning for the king, predicting famine, victory, or plague. Far from superstition alone, these were sophisticated attempts to find order in the cosmos. The gods, it was believed, spoke through patterns, and so patterns had to be found. To do this, Babylonian scholars developed a mathematical toolkit that was centuries ahead of its time. They used a sexagesimal, or base 60 number system, the reason we still divide the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees. This base allowed for convenient fractions, making complex astronomical calculations more manageable. Some tablets contain what modern scholars recognize as proto-algebraic problem sets, exercises for students of the scribal schools. Others hint at knowledge of geometric progressions and sophisticated methods for predicting planetary motion using what we would today call arithmetic series. One of the most remarkable discoveries is a tablet now held in the British Museum, dating to around 1800 BCE, which contains a list of Pythagorean triples, whole numbers satisfying the famous A2 plus B2 E C2 relationship, 1,000 years before Pythagoras himself. This suggests that Babylonian mathematics was not merely practical but abstract, capable of recognizing deep numerical relationships that later became cornerstones of Greek geometry. And yet, despite this mathematical brilliance, Babylonian thought never fully detached itself from its religious matrix. For them, numbers and stars were not merely quantities or distant suns, but signs of cosmic will. Each calculation was a form of divination, an attempt to read the mind of the gods. In this, they prefigured the tension that would run through all of later science, between empirical measurement and the search for meaning. The transmission of this knowledge was as important as its discovery. Babylonian astronomy did not remain confined to the Euphrates Valley. During the Persian and Hellenistic periods, Greek scholars encountered Babylonian methods and adopted them. Hipparchus, often called the father of trigonometry, relied on Babylonian eclipse records to refine his own astronomical theories. Even Claudius Ptolemy's Almagest, the great synthesis of ancient astronomy, rests in part on foundations laid in Mesopotamia. What is striking is how much of this intellectual world was built on clay, fragile, breakable, yet strangely eternal. The tablets endured the burning of cities and the fall of dynasties. They lay buried for millennia until rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. Today, we read them as both data and poetry, the careful hand of a scribe noting, "On the night of the 14th, the moon was eaten." There is an intimacy in these records, as if we are watching the same sky through ancient eyes. We can almost feel the tension as a priest waits for the first glimmer of Venus before dawn, knowing that its appearance might signal war or peace. We can imagine the quiet satisfaction when a predicted eclipse arrives precisely on schedule, confirming that the heavens still obey their hidden cycles. And still, there are mysteries. Some tablets contain mathematical techniques whose reasoning we do not fully understand, suggesting a level of abstraction lost to us. Others remain untranslated, their cuneiform signs waiting to reveal what they once taught. There may yet be discoveries in museum storerooms or beneath the sands that will change our picture of how far Babylonian science truly reached. Standing on the ruins of Babylon, one can still look up and see the same constellations that guided those ancient scribes. Orion still strides across the winter sky. The moon still waxes and wanes in its measured dance. The stars are silent, yet they carry with them the memory of a civilization that first dared to measure their paths, to seek meaning in their motion. Perhaps this is Babylon's most enduring gift, the conviction that the universe is ordered, that patterns can be found, and that by tracing them, we might learn not only about the world, but about ourselves. Yet one wonders, did the Babylonians ever fear that the patterns they saw might reveal not destiny, but indifference? Did they ever stand beneath a sky so vast that even their careful numbers felt small? The tablets give us answers, but they also leave us with questions. The same questions that pull our gaze upward even today. What did they hope to find night after night on those high temple platforms? And what might still be written, waiting for us in the heavens above? Chapter 20, Cyrus the Great and the Persian Conquest. The year was 539 BCE. Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, still glittered with walls said to be so broad that chariots could race across their tops. Its gates of bronze shone under the desert. Its temples echoed with the voices of priests, and the Euphrates flowed quietly through the heart of the city. Babylon had stood for centuries as a beacon of wealth and knowledge, its kings tracing their line back into the deepest shadows of history. Yet on this night, a shift would occur that would mark the end of Mesopotamian independence forever. Into its gates marched a conqueror from the east, Cyrus of Persia, whose name would echo across empires. Cyrus was unlike many conquerors of the ancient world. Born around 600 BCE in the rugged landscapes of Persis, he emerged from a modest principality to unite the Iranian tribes beneath his banner. By the mid-6th century BCE, he had defeated the Medes, the Lydians, and the rising powers that challenged his vision of empire. His army was disciplined, but it was not merely force of arms that secured his victories. Cyrus carried with him a reputation for clemency, for pragmatism, and for a strikingly novel approach to rule. Where others destroyed, he absorbed. Where others erased, he allowed traditions to endure. The fall of Babylon is remembered not as a fiery sack, but as a quiet capitulation. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle, a Babylonian tablet describing the events, Cyrus's army entered the city without battle. Why, The Euphrates may have been diverted, allowing his troops to slip beneath the walls through the riverbed. Yet the absence of resistance tells its own story. The last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, had alienated both priesthood and people, devoting himself to the moon god Sin while neglecting Marduk, the traditional guardian of Babylon. Discontent festered in the temples and the streets, leaving the city vulnerable to the promise of a new order. When Cyrus entered Babylon, he did so with ceremony. His proclamations spoke not of conquest, but of liberation. The most famous of these survives on a clay cylinder now preserved in the British Museum. Known as the Cyrus Cylinder, it has been called the first declaration of human rights, though scholars debate this interpretation. In its cuneiform script, Cyrus presents himself as chosen by Marduk, the great god of Babylon, to restore justice and peace. He declares that he returned displaced peoples to their homelands, allowed shrines to be rebuilt, and respected the worship of diverse gods. Whether propaganda or genuine policy, the words reveal a vision of empire not through destruction, but through accommodation. For the peoples of Mesopotamia, this was a turning point. No longer would they stand at the center of their own world. From this moment, Babylon became one jewel in a far larger imperial crown. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. The ancient Sumerian and Akkadian traditions that had once given birth to writing, law, and monumental architecture were now subsumed beneath Persian administration. Yet Cyrus did not erase them. The temples continued to stand. The gods continued to be honored. Priests still recorded offerings on clay tablets, though now under the watchful eyes of satraps, the Persian governors who carried out imperial rule. The symbolic weight of Babylon's fall reached far beyond Mesopotamia. To the Hebrews exiled in the city, Cyrus appeared as a deliverer. Biblical texts remember him as an instrument of the divine, the one who allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Few conquerors in history have been praised both in the inscriptions of their empire and in the scriptures of those they ruled. Yet beneath this aura of magnanimity lies the reality of imperial power. Cyrus's tolerance was not the absence of domination, but its refinement. By permitting diverse peoples to honor their gods and traditions, he transformed potential rebellion into loyalty. The empire's strength lay in its ability to weave differences into a unified whole. Babylon, with its immense prestige, was not humiliated, but incorporated. Its grandeur became part of the Persian story. Archaeological remains from this era reflect both continuity and change. The processional ways and palaces of Babylon remained active, but new inscriptions bore the names of Persian kings. Administrative tablets from the early Achaemenid period reveal the machinery of taxation and labor continuing almost seamlessly. To walk through Babylon in the years after 539 BCE may not have felt like stepping into a conquered city, but into one whose destiny had been redirected. Its monuments intact, its rituals alive, but its sovereignty gone. The death of Mesopotamian independence came quietly. Then, not in the roar of flames, but in the silence of acquiescence. Cyrus the Great ensured that the torch of civilization would not be extinguished, but carried forward, bound into the fabric of an empire larger than the world had ever known. And yet, one cannot help but wonder how it felt for those who lived within Babylon's walls. Did they see themselves as liberated, as Cyrus claimed, or as subjects under a new master, their ancient pride subdued? As the centuries passed, Babylon would endure as a provincial capital, still adorned with its gates and temples, but no longer commanding the fate of empires. The memory of its independence faded into the realm of legend, while Persia rose in its place. And in that moment of transition, we see a pattern that would repeat again and again. The inheritance of Mesopotamia carried forward not by those who built it, but by those who claimed it. The cylinder of Cyrus still speaks across millennia, a fragile artifact of clay inscribed with promises of justice and tolerance. Whether those promises were fulfilled, or whether they were crafted to soothe conquered peoples, remains uncertain. Yet the voice it carries is distinct from so many conquerors of the past. Not the cry of dominance, but the invitation of unity. And so, in the fall of Babylon to Cyrus, we witness not only the end of one civilization's independence, but the birth of a new vision of empire, one that raised questions still resonant today about power, tolerance, and the price of peace. Questions that linger like the silent stones of Babylon, waiting for us to listen. Chapter 21. The Decline of Cuneiform. Writing. For 3 millennia, the wedge-shaped signs of cuneiform had carried the weight of empires. They had recorded the first kings, the first laws, the first stories ever written. They had tallied sheep and silver, invoked gods, mapped stars, and sung laments for fallen cities. Yet by the first centuries of the Common Era, this entire tradition, the script that had given birth to history itself, had fallen silent. The decline of cuneiform was not sudden. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the languages of power and administration shifted. After the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 539 BCE, Babylon and its scribes came under Persian rule. The Persian kings favored Aramaic for their imperial bureaucracy. Unlike cuneiform, Aramaic was an alphabetic script, simpler to learn, faster to write. Clay tablets, which required damp clay and reed styluses, gradually gave way to ink on parchment and papyrus. By the 4th century BCE, when Alexander the Great swept through Mesopotamia, the ancient writing system was already retreating into the temples, preserved mostly by scholarly priests. But cuneiform was not just a script, it was a vast intellectual tradition. The scribal schools, or edubas, had trained generations of scholars to copy and recopy the canonical texts, myths, hymns, omen lists, and lexical catalogues. As Greek and Aramaic gained dominance, fewer and fewer students were trained in the old ways. What had once been the language of kings became the guarded knowledge of a dwindling priesthood. Some of the last cuneiform tablets we possess date from the 1st century CE and come from Uruk, the ancient city of Gilgamesh. They are astronomical texts recording planetary positions with the same meticulousness that had characterized Babylonian scholarship for centuries. One tablet from around 75 CE records the position of Jupiter, a sign that even as Rome ruled the Near East, a handful of scribes were still climbing the ziggurats to watch the sky, still pressing their findings into wet clay. But soon after, the tradition ends. The wedge marks disappear from history. What was lost in this transition is difficult to measure. We know that entire libraries of texts once existed, collections of incantations, medical treatises, hymns and epics that may never have been copied into the newer scripts. Each clay tablet that survives is likely one of many, part of a larger series that has been broken by time. Archaeologists have found tablets with references to other works we have never seen, works whose titles alone hint at vast mythic or scientific traditions now gone. The silence that followed was profound. When Greek and Roman writers encountered the ruins of Mesopotamian cities, they could no longer read the inscriptions that covered the walls. By the Middle Ages, even the memory of how to read cuneiform was gone. The wedge-shaped symbols became mute decoration, their meaning locked away until the 19th century, when scholars like Georg Friedrich Grotefend and Henry Rawlinson painstakingly deciphered them. And yet, even in its decline, cuneiform left its imprint on later cultures. The stories it preserved, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the flood narrative of Atrahasis, echoed through Hebrew scripture and later traditions. The mathematical and astronomical systems of Babylon were absorbed by Greek thinkers and carried forward. But we cannot escape the sense that much more was lost than was saved. Whole libraries of knowledge, erased not by conquest alone, but by the gradual turning of cultural tides. One imagines the last scribes, working by lamplight in the shadow of a crumbling ziggurat, aware that their craft was dying. Did they feel themselves guardians of a sacred trust, or simply relics of another age? When they pressed the last tablets, did they know they were closing a chapter of human history? Today, the remains of cuneiform lie in museums, neatly labeled and displayed. But to look upon them is to feel the weight of a vanished world, one that spoke through clay and silence. The script that once told the first stories now challenges us to imagine all the stories that will never be told again. What might still lie buried, waiting for an archaeologist's trowel? What wisdom might resurface from the earth, bringing back voices that have been silent for nearly 2,000 years? And would we recognize their meaning if they spoke again? Chapter 22. Rediscovery. In the modern era for centuries, the ruins of Mesopotamia lay forgotten beneath the shifting sands. The names of its cities, Nineveh, Babylon, lingered in scripture, myth, and half-remembered chronicles, but their stones were hidden. To travelers crossing the plains of modern-day Iraq, the remains of entire civilizations appeared only as strange mounds rising from the earth, windswept and silent. Villagers called them tells, heaps of ancient debris, but their true identities were lost to time. It was as if the land itself had swallowed its past, leaving only whispers of kings and gods whose temples once towered above the desert. By the early 19th century, Europe was gripped by an age of exploration and empire. Egypt had already yielded its treasures, its hieroglyphs decoded by Champollion, its monuments stirring the imagination of the West. But Mesopotamia remained an enigma. The land between the rivers was known from the Bible, from Greek historians, from scattered legends, yet no one could say with certainty where its palaces or temples lay. To step into this unknown promised not only adventure, but the possibility of recovering the world's oldest written words. Among the first to take up the challenge was Austin Henry Layard, a young Englishman drawn more by curiosity than formal training. In the 1840s, Layard began excavating vast mounds near the Tigris River. What he uncovered would astonish Europe. From beneath layers of earth emerged colossal winged bulls with human faces, carved in alabaster. The Lamassu, guardians of Assyrian palaces. Walls surfaced covered in reliefs, scenes of hunting, of sieges, of kings and captives, each figure etched with precise detail. Layard had found the lost city of Nineveh. Soon after, another mound yielded the ruins of Nimrud, once the capital of Ashurnasirpal II. There, he uncovered magnificent wall panels showing the Assyrian king engaged in lion hunts, his bow drawn, his chariot in motion. These reliefs, shipped back to the British Museum, electrified audiences. They seem to confirm the fearsome reputation of the Assyrian war machine, once remembered only in biblical warnings. The Assyrians, long reduced to shadows of scripture, were suddenly made tangible. Statues with staring eyes, inscriptions in wedge-shaped script, and palaces stretching across acres. The discoveries ignited a new discipline, Assyriology. Scholars, faced with thousands of clay tablets covered in cuneiform, set themselves to the task of decipherment. The script had been known since travelers first brought tablets to Europe in the 17th century, but its meaning was elusive. Unlike hieroglyphs, there was no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text to guide the way. Each wedge pressed into clay seemed to hold a code no one could break. Gradually, through the work of scholars like Georg Friedrich Grotefend, Henry Rawlinson, and Edward Hincks, the mystery unraveled. Rawlinson, a British officer stationed in Persia, played a decisive role. High up on the cliffs of Behistun, he copied a monumental trilingual inscription commissioned by Darius the Great. Written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform, it offered the long-sought key. By comparing the scripts, Rawlinson and others began to unlock the language of Mesopotamia. By the mid-19th century, scholars could read royal inscriptions, administrative records, and mythic epics that had not been seen for over 2,000 years. The rediscovery of these texts was nothing short of revolutionary. From the libraries of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh came thousands of tablets, including fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Stories of gods, kings, and floods emerged, echoing traditions familiar from the Hebrew Bible, yet older still. For many in Europe, this was a disquieting revelation. The Bible, long treated as the primary record of the ancient Near East, was now joined by voices from clay that told parallel and sometimes conflicting tales. Scholars debated fiercely. Had the Mesopotamians influenced biblical tradition? Were these myths independent or reflections of a deeper, shared memory? Beyond religion, the finds reshaped human history. Mesopotamia was revealed not as a land of scattered tribes, but as the birthplace of cities, writing, and empire. The Sumerians, whose very existence had been doubted, were confirmed through inscriptions. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians were no longer vague names, but cultures with detailed records of law, trade, astronomy, and literature. The very timeline of civilization shifted, pushing its origins thousands of years deeper into the past. The excavations also revealed tensions of another kind. As treasures filled the halls of the British Museum, the Louvre, and later Berlin's Pergamon Museum, questions arose about ownership. Reliefs and statues, stripped from their original settings, became symbols of European power as much as of ancient Assyria. In Iraq itself, the ruins were left scarred by trenches and hurried digs. Even today, debates continue over whether these artifacts belong in Western museums or should return to the lands from which they came. Yet despite the controversies, the rediscovery of Mesopotamia transformed the modern imagination. Writers and artists found new inspiration in the colossal forms of Assyrian art. Historians began piecing together the chronology of forgotten empires, and ordinary readers encountered, often for the first time, the voices of people who had lived and died more than 4,000 years earlier. One of the most haunting aspects of this rediscovery is the sense of continuity it restored. A clay tablet recording a merchant's debt, a farmer's ration of barley, or a hymn to a forgotten god suddenly bridges millennia. The wedge-shaped marks may seem alien, but they reveal concerns familiar to us still. Food, justice, faith, survival. The modern world, in uncovering these fragments, found itself reflected in the ancient one. Even now, the process is unfinished. Archaeologists continue to unearth tablets from the soil of Iraq and Syria, many of which remain unread in museum collections. Each new discovery has the potential to reshape what we know of lore, of myth, of the earliest experiments in human governance. The story of Mesopotamia is not only one of rise and fall, but of rediscovery, loss, and rediscovery again. And so, after lying buried for millennia, the cities of Mesopotamia rose once more into human memory. Not rebuilt in mud, brick, and stone, but reconstructed in fragments, tablets, and the patient work of scholars. They remind us that history, however deeply buried, waits to be found again. The sands had concealed Nineveh and Nimrud, Babylon and Ur, but they could not silence them forever. With each unearthed tablet, each deciphered sign, the voices of the first cities return, whispering to those who listen. What more lies hidden still beneath the unmarked mounds of Mesopotamia? Chapter 23, The Flood Tablet and the Search for Origins, in the winter of 1872. A young British museum assistant stood before a clay tablet, its surface inscribed with the wedge-shaped writing of a long-forgotten tongue. The assistant's name was George Smith, a self-taught scholar of cuneiform, who had spent countless hours poring over tablets from Nineveh. On that day, as he traced the characters with his finger, he realized what he had found: a story of a great flood, a divine command to build a boat, the gathering of animals, and the sending forth of birds to find dry land. It was, in every essential detail, a parallel to the biblical story of Noah. Yet this tablet came from the library of Ashurbanipal, and its story had been written more than 1,000 years before the book of Genesis. The discovery electrified Victorian Britain. The text, known today as the Flood Tablet, is part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving work of literature. Its lines recount how Utnapishtim, a wise man, was warned by the god Ea of a coming deluge that would wipe out humanity. He was instructed to build a massive boat, seal it with pitch, and bring aboard his family, craftsmen, and the seed of all living creatures. When the waters came, they raged for 6 days and 6 nights, covering even the mountaintops. At last, Utnapishtim released a dove, a swallow, and a raven, and when the raven did not return, he knew the waters had receded. For the first time, scholars were confronted with a Mesopotamian version of the flood story that had long been considered uniquely biblical. Some saw it as confirmation, evidence that the story of Noah preserved an authentic memory of a real, ancient flood. Others saw it as a challenge. If the Mesopotamians had told this tale long before the Hebrew scriptures were composed, then what did that mean for the originality of the biblical narrative? The implications went far beyond theology. Here was proof that ancient Mesopotamia had preserved a myth of cosmic catastrophe that stretched deep into the past. And it was not just Mesopotamia. Flood myths occur across cultures, from India's story of Manu, to the Greek tale of Deucalion and Pyrrha, to the traditions of indigenous peoples in the Americas. The flood tablets seem to hint at a shared memory, a story carried across continents, perhaps rooted in a real event, or at least a real fear that haunted early humanity. Archaeologically, the tablet came from the ruins of Nineveh, from the royal library of Ashurbanipal. discovered by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the mid-19th century. Tens of thousands of tablets were shipped back to the British Museum, where scholars like Smith laboured to piece them together. The flood tablet itself is fragmentary, its edges broken, its story incomplete. But even in fragments, it changed how we view the ancient world. The Mesopotamian flood story belongs to a much older tradition than Gilgamesh itself. Its earliest known version appears in the Atrahasis epic, dating to the Old Babylonian period around the 17th century BCE. Atrahasis, like Utnapishtim, is warned by the gods and builds a boat to preserve life. Scholars believe that the Gilgamesh version is a later retelling, woven into the hero's quest for immortality. When Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, he seeks the secret of eternal life, and in reply, the survivor of the flood tells him the story of how he alone was granted immortality by the gods, as a reward for saving humankind. What did these stories mean to the people who told them? Perhaps they were not merely tales of disaster, but meditations on divine justice, survival, and the fragile line between order and chaos. In the Mesopotamian telling, the flood is sent not because of human wickedness, but because humanity had become too numerous and too noisy, disturbing the sleep of the gods. The solution was almost total annihilation, and the survival of a single family was a mercy, not a covenant. This difference is telling. Where the Genesis story frames the flood as a moral reckoning, the Mesopotamian story reflects a different worldview, one in which the gods are capricious, and human survival depends on cunning, not virtue. Yet the parallels are too striking to ignore. The boat, the animals, the birds, the mountain landing. Somewhere in the deep past, these stories must share a common root, or at least a common inspiration. Modern geology offers some intriguing possibilities. Around 5600 BCE, the Black Sea is believed to have undergone a catastrophic flooding event when rising Mediterranean waters broke through the Bosporus and rapidly inundated the basin. Others suggest that the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates themselves, sudden and devastating, could have given rise to a story that grew over generations into a myth of world-destroying proportions. Still others argue for a memory of much older global disasters, the melting of ice sheets at the end of the last ice age, or even more distant cataclysms lost to time. Whatever its origin, the flood tablet reminds us that myth is a form of memory, and that memory can outlast history. The fact that this story survived in clay for thousands of years, only to be rediscovered and read again, is itself a kind of resurrection. George Smith, when he first translated it, was so overcome by emotion that he reportedly stripped off his clothes in the museum, shouting with joy. In that moment, a forgotten voice from Bronze Age Mesopotamia had spoken again, bridging millennia. And yet, for every tablet that has been found, there are many more that remain buried or broken. How many versions of the flood story might have existed now lost? What further details, names, or histories might lie hidden in the sands of Iraq and Syria, awaiting excavation? The flood tablet is not only a story of the past, it is a mirror reflecting humanity's oldest fears and deepest hopes. It asks whether destruction is ever final, whether life can begin again after catastrophe. It leaves us wondering if the flood was a single event or an eternal metaphor, echoing through every culture to remind us of the waters that wait beyond the edges of order. And as we move deeper into the study of these ancient texts, we are left with a lingering question. Was this story merely myth, or the distant memory of something that truly happened? So powerful that humanity has never been able to forget. Chapter 24. Looting, War, and the Fragile Legacy. For thousands of years, the ruins of Mesopotamia lay hidden beneath layers of sand and time, protected not by walls or armies, but by obscurity. When explorers and archaeologists first uncovered them in the 19th century, the buried cities stirred with life again. Statues emerged from the dust, inscriptions returned their voices to forgotten kings, and libraries of clay tablets revealed the thoughts of people who lived 5,000 years ago. Yet the modern rediscovery of Mesopotamia has not been a story only of wonder and preservation. It has also been one of loss, violence, and destruction, sometimes deliberate, sometimes careless, often irreparable. War has always left scars on the ancient land between the rivers, but in recent decades the damage has been especially devastating. During the Gulf War in 1991, bombs fell close to Babylon itself. Though much of the city's ruins were spared, The shock of conflict reminded the world how fragile archaeological heritage can be. In 2003, during the invasion of Iraq, chaos swept through Baghdad, and looters stormed the Iraq Museum. Thousands of priceless artifacts, cylinder seals, cuneiform tablets, sculptures, and jewelry were stolen. Some have since resurfaced on the black market or been recovered, but many more vanished forever. They're fragments of human memory scattered into private collections or lost beyond reach. The ruins themselves also suffered. At Babylon, military forces established a base atop the ancient city. Heavy vehicles churned through fragile earthworks, damaging the processional way and crushing brick pavements first laid more than 2,000 years ago. In other sites across Iraq, looters dug trenches by night, tearing through ancient layers in search of artifacts to sell. Satellite imagery has revealed landscapes pockmarked with holes, entire sites riddled with scars. Each hole represents not only a stolen object, but the destruction of context. The stories that careful excavation could have told are gone forever. The deliberate targeting of heritage reached a new level in the rise of the so-called Islamic State in the 2010s. Their fighters captured cities and museums across Iraq and Syria, reducing to rubble what had stood for millennia. In Mosul, statues of Assyrian kings were toppled and smashed. At Nimrud, bulldozers leveled the remains of palaces once adorned with carved reliefs of lion hunts and battles. In Hatra, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, temples were dynamited, their stones scattered in clouds of dust. The destruction was not incidental but ideological, a calculated attempt to erase the past, to sever communities from their cultural memory, and to capture global attention through acts of erasure. And yet, even in the midst of tragedy, there have been moments of resilience. Iraqi archaeologists, often working under dangerous conditions, have continued their efforts to document, protect, and conserve what remains. International teams too have returned when possible, training local specialists, stabilizing crumbling structures, and attempting to recover looted artifacts. Digital technology has begun to play a vital role. High-resolution photography, 3D scanning, and satellite monitoring allow sites to be recorded, reconstructed virtually, and, in some cases, defended against further destruction. The ruins may be fragile, but their memory can now be preserved in new and unexpected ways. The question of ownership and return has also gained urgency. Many Mesopotamian treasures reside in museums far from their homeland, in London, Paris, Berlin, and New York. Some were excavated legally in earlier centuries, others taken under looser definitions of consent in colonial times. Today, Iraq and other nations are calling for restitution. In recent years, a number of artifacts, including the famous Gilgamesh dream tablet, have been returned. Each act of repatriation restores not only an object, but a thread of cultural identity long displaced. Still, the damage lingers. Archaeology depends on patience, precision, and context. Looting rips artifacts from their setting, stripping them of meaning. A clay tablet in a museum storeroom may still bear its inscription, but without knowledge of where it was found, among what other remains, its voice is muted. War, looting, and neglect rob us not only of beauty, but of understanding. They deny future generations the chance to learn from the past as fully as we might. And yet, the sands of Mesopotamia still hold secrets. Many sites remain unexcavated, their stories untouched beneath the soil. In some places, layers of history lie preserved as they were left thousands of years ago, waiting for careful hands and trained eyes. New technologies may reveal what was once thought lost. Buried walls detected through ground-penetrating radar, texts reconstructed from fragments by artificial intelligence, digital archives piecing together broken inscriptions across continents. The legacy of Mesopotamia may be fragile, but it is not gone. In reflecting on what has been lost and what survives, we confront both the vulnerability and endurance of human memory. The Lamassu of Nineveh may have been shattered, but their images remain, carved into photographs, drawings, and even the impressions they left on the travelers who first saw them. The Epic of Gilgamesh has been fragmented across libraries and looted tablets, yet its verses still echo across the world. Babylon's walls may be scarred, but the idea of Babylon, its gardens, its gates, its towers, continues to haunt imagination. The fragile legacy of Mesopotamia is a mirror of our own responsibility. What we choose to protect, to recover, to remember, will shape how future generations see not only the past but themselves. The ruins are not simply remnants of a distant civilization. They are testaments to humanity's first cities, first laws, first stories. To lose them is to lose part of our shared beginning. And so the final reflection lingers. In the dust of looted storerooms, in the broken stones of ruined temples, in the faint impressions of cuneiform wedges on clay, something of Mesopotamia still waits. It waits for careful hands, for reverent hearts, for a time when the world values not only power, but memory. For even in fragility there is endurance, and beneath the sands, stories yet untold still lie in silence, awaiting their return to light.